Somewhere in the vast, empty expanse of the southeastern Pacific Ocean, more than 2,000 miles from the nearest populated landmass, there sits a small volcanic island shaped like a triangle. It is one of the most isolated inhabited places on the entire planet. The wind howls across its treeless grasslands. Enormous stone heads stare outward with hollow eyes from the edges of its cliffs. And buried in the soil, hidden in caves, smuggled across oceans, and scattered into the collections of museums and private holders across the world, there exist exactly 26 surviving artifacts that may hold the key to understanding one of the greatest mysteries in human history. They are wooden tablets, some are fragments, some are driftwood, some are fashioned from local trees. And every inch of their surfaces is covered in tiny, intricate symbols carved with obsidian flakes or shark teeth, row after row of strange figures that look like nothing else ever produced by any civilization, anywhere on Earth. Birds with human heads, fish that transform into geometric shapes, crescents and circles and abstract forms arranged in lines that reverse direction with every row, a writing pattern so unusual that scholars had to invent a new term just to describe it. These symbols are called Rongorongo, and to this day, despite over a century and a half of effort by the finest linguistic minds in the world, despite the application of artificial intelligence and computational analysis, despite comparative studies with every known writing system from every corner of every continent, not a single line of Rongorongo has been definitively, conclusively, universally deciphered. No one alive can read these tablets. No one alive can say with certainty what they contain. And here is the part that should trouble you, the part that should keep you awake at night. Whoever carved these symbols, whoever held these tablets in their hands and understood what they said, those people are gone. They were taken, they were enslaved, they were killed by disease. They were erased from the face of the earth in one of the most devastating cultural catastrophes in recorded history. And when they vanished, they took with them the knowledge of what these wooden boards actually say. We are left with the objects, we are left with the carvings, we are left with the mystery. And the mystery asks us a question that we have never been able to answer. What were they trying to tell us? What knowledge did they encode? What stories, what histories, what warnings, what prayers, what records of a civilization that built things we still cannot fully explain, what was written on those boards? This is the story of Rongorongo. This is the story of Easter Island's undeciphered script. And this is the story of why the silence of those 26 wooden tablets may be one of the greatest losses in the entire history of human knowledge. To understand Rongorongo, you must first understand the island where it was born. And to understand the island, you must understand how extraordinary, how improbable, and how deeply strange it truly is. The island is called Rapanui by its indigenous people. Europeans called it Easter Island because a Dutch explorer named Jacob Roggeveen first sighted it on Easter Sunday in the year 1722. It sits at approximately 27 degrees south latitude and 109 degrees west longitude. It is roughly 63 square miles in area, small enough that you could drive around its entire perimeter in a few hours if you had a road that followed the coast. Its nearest inhabited neighbor is Pitcairn Island, more than 1,300 miles to the west, and Pitcairn itself is home to fewer than 50 people. The coast of South America lies more than 2,300 miles to the east. In every direction there is nothing but ocean, horizon, and sky. This island, this speck of volcanic rock in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth, was settled by Polynesian navigators sometime between the years 800 and 1200 of the Common Era. The exact date remains debated among archaeologists and geneticists, but the consensus has narrowed in recent decades toward the later part of that range, perhaps around 1100 or 1200. These settlers came from the west, most likely from the Marquesas Islands or the Mangareva Group, traveling in double-hulled voyaging canoes across thousands of miles of open ocean, navigating by the stars, the currents, the behavior of birds, and the patterns of waves. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it means to set out across the Pacific Ocean in a wooden canoe, with no compass, no chart, no guarantee that land exists in the direction you are heading, with only the food and water you can carry, with your families, your animals, your seeds, your tools, your gods. Think about the courage that requires. Think about the knowledge that requires. These were not primitive people stumbling blindly across the sea. These were master navigators, the inheritors of a tradition of oceanic exploration that had been perfected over thousands of years, a tradition that had already carried Polynesian peoples across millions of square miles of ocean, from the islands of Southeast Asia to Hawaii, from New Zealand to the far-flung atolls of the Central Pacific. The people who settled Rapa Nui were extraordinary. And the civilization they built on that tiny island over the course of several centuries was unlike anything else in the Pacific, and in many ways unlike anything else in the world. They are famous, of course, for the Moai, the enormous stone statues that line the coasts of the island, standing on ceremonial platforms called ahu. There are nearly 900 of these statues scattered across Rapa Nui. The largest ever erected stands nearly 33 feet tall and weighs approximately 82 tons. An even larger one, never finished, lies in the quarry at the volcano Rongorongo, and it would have stood nearly 70 feet tall and weighed close to 270 tons had it ever been completed. These statues were carved from compressed volcanic ash using stone tools, transported across miles of rough terrain without wheels or draft animals, and erected on platforms without cranes or pulleys. How this was accomplished has been the subject of intense debate and experimentation for decades, but the fundamental point is this. The people of Rapa Nui accomplished feats of engineering and organization that would challenge modern teams equipped with modern technology. But the Moai are only the most visible expression of a civilization that was far more complex and sophisticated than the outside world has generally recognized. The people of Rapa Nui developed a highly stratified society with a paramount chief, the Eyraud, who was considered sacred and whose power was believed to derive from the gods themselves. They built elaborate ceremonial centers. They developed an agricultural system that allowed them to feed thousands of people on an island with limited freshwater and increasingly degraded soil. They created a rich tradition of oral literature, including creation chants, genealogies, hymns, and historical narratives. They developed complex rituals, including the famous Birdman ceremony at the volcanic crater of Rongorongo, in which representatives of rival clans competed in a dangerous annual contest to retrieve the first egg of the sooty tern from a nearby islet, with the winner's patron becoming the Birdman, the Tangata Manu, who held significant political and spiritual authority for the following year. This was a civilization. This was a culture of depth, complexity, and achievement. And this civilization produced something that no other Polynesian culture, and indeed very few cultures in the entire history of humanity, ever independently produced. They invented writing, or at least they appear to have invented writing. And that qualifier, that uncertainty, is itself one of the central mysteries of Rongorongo. The existence of a script on Easter Island was not immediately recognized by the first Europeans to visit. Jacob Roggeveen and his crew spent only a single day on the island in 1722. The Spanish expedition led by Felipe González de Ejido arrived in 1770 and spent several days claiming the island for Spain. During this visit, a remarkable event occurred. The Spanish presented a document of annexation to the island's chiefs and asked them to sign it. The chiefs responded by marking the document with strange symbols, not signatures as Europeans understood them, but distinctive marks that some later scholars have speculated might have been glyphs from their writing system. If so, this would be one of the earliest documented encounters between European writing and Rongorongo. But the Spanish, absorbed in the formalities of their colonial ritual, paid little attention to the nature of these marks and recorded no detailed description of them. Captain James Cook arrived in 1774 and spent 4 days at Rapa Nui. His expedition noted the Moai, the state of the islanders, and various aspects of their culture, but made no mention whatsoever of any writing system. This silence is puzzling but not inexplicable. Cook's party had limited interaction with the islanders and was focused on practical matters of navigation and supply. Writing, if it existed, was likely kept within sacred and elite contexts and would not have been casually displayed to foreign visitors. The next significant European contact came in the form of a visit by the Russian ship Rurik in 1816, but again, no wooden tablets or inscribed objects were described. And so, for over a century after European contact began, the writing system of Rapanui remained unknown to the outside world. The reason for this prolonged invisibility is almost certainly connected to the nature of Rongorongo itself. Everything we have been able to piece together from later testimony suggests that the tablets were sacred objects, closely guarded by a literate elite, most likely a priestly class or the entourage of the paramount chief. They were not everyday objects, they were not trade goods, they were not things that would have been shown to foreign visitors under normal circumstances. They were items of spiritual and political power, and their contents were the exclusive province of those trained to read and recite them. This brings us to a crucial question that we must confront early in this story, because it shapes everything that follows. Who could read the tablets? How many people possessed this knowledge? And what happened to them? The answers to these questions are devastating. By the time the outside world became aware of Rongorongo, it was already too late. The catastrophe that destroyed the literate culture of Rapa Nui did not come from within. It came from beyond the horizon, carried in the holds of ships. The 19th century was an era of unrestrained exploitation across the Pacific. Whaling ships, trading vessels, and slavers roamed the ocean, and the islands they visited were often subjected to violence, disease, and depopulation on an almost unimaginable scale. Rapa Nui, isolated and vulnerable, was struck by a series of blows that would have been fatal to any small society. The first major disaster came in December of 1862 and continued into 1863. A fleet of Peruvian slave raiders descended upon the island and captured approximately 1,500 people, roughly a third of the island's entire population. Among those taken were the Arequipa, the paramount chief, his heir, and virtually the entire class of learned men, the Tangata Rongorongo, the specialists who could read and write the script. They were taken to Peru and sold as forced laborers on plantations and in the guano mines of the Chincha Islands, where conditions were so brutal that the vast majority of them died within months. The scale of this loss cannot be overstated. Imagine a society in which literacy is concentrated among a small educated elite, priests, scribes, nobles. Now imagine that nearly every single member of that elite is kidnapped in a single raid and worked to death in a foreign land. That is what happened to Rapa Nui. The people who could read the tablets, who could interpret the symbols, who could pass on the knowledge to the next generation, they were taken and they died, and they took their knowledge with them. International pressure, particularly from the French government, eventually forced Peru to repatriate some of the enslaved islanders. But by the time the survivors were gathered for the return voyage, disease had already ravaged them. Of the few who were placed on ships bound for Rapa Nui, most died during the journey. Some accounts say that only 15 of the original 1,500 ever set foot on the island again. Others put the number even lower. And those who did return brought with them smallpox and tuberculosis, which then swept through the already devastated population. By 1877, the population of Rapa Nui had fallen to just 111 people. 111 from a population that had once numbered in the thousands, perhaps as many as 15,000 at its peak. An entire civilization with its knowledge, its traditions, its histories, its spiritual practices, and its writing system had been reduced to a handful of traumatized survivors, most of whom were too young, too removed from the literate elite, or too shattered by the experience to preserve the full cultural heritage of their people. Among the many things lost in this catastrophe was the ability to read Rongorongo. By the time anyone thought to ask whether the surviving islanders could interpret the tablets, it was already too late. The readers were dead, the tradition was broken. The chain of transmission, which had likely passed from master to student through generations of careful instruction, had been severed beyond repair. This is the context in which Rongorongo enters the Western historical record. it enters not as a living tradition, but as a corpse. It enters not with voices that can explain it, but with silence, and it is in that silence that the mystery begins. The man who first brought the Rongorongo tablets to the attention of the outside world was a French missionary named Eugene Eyraud. He arrived on Rapanui on January 2nd, 1864, just months after the Peruvian slave raids had devastated the island. Eyraud was a lay brother of the Congregation of the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary, and he had come to convert the islanders to Christianity. He was alone, unarmed, and entirely dependent on the goodwill of a traumatized and suspicious population. Eyraud spent approximately 9 months on the island during his first stay. He endured hunger, illness, theft of his possessions, and intense hostility. But he was an observant man, and he recorded what he saw. In a letter written to his superiors and later published in the Annals of the Propagation of the Faith, Eyraud made a remark that would echo through the next century and a half of scholarly inquiry. He wrote in 1866 that in every house on the island he found wooden tablets or staffs covered with hieroglyphic signs. He described the figures as images of animals unknown on the island, which the natives traced using sharp stones. He noted that each figure had its own name, but that the islanders paid little attention to these tablets and did not seem to understand or value them. He observed that the people made no use of the tablets in their daily lives and treated them casually. This observation has been the subject of much debate. Was Eyraud correct that the islanders no longer understood the tablets? Or was he simply an outsider, unable to recognize the significance of what he was seeing, misinterpreting indifference or secrecy as ignorance? The missionary perspective was often limited by cultural bias, a tendency to see indigenous practices as meaningless superstition, and it is entirely possible that the islanders were deliberately concealing the significance of the tablets from a foreign intruder. But there is another possibility, one that is more troubling. By 1864, the slave raids had already occurred. The learned class had already been taken. The readers were already dead or dying in Peru. It is possible, perhaps even likely, that by the time Eyraud arrived, most of the surviving islanders genuinely could no longer read the tablets. They possessed the objects, but they had lost the knowledge. The tablets had become artifacts of a world that had been destroyed only months or years before. If this interpretation is correct, then Eyraud was witnessing not carelessness but grief. He was witnessing a people surrounded by the physical remnants of a knowledge they had just lost, holding objects that had once been sacred and meaningful but were now mute. The tablets had become monuments to absence. Regardless of the islanders' understanding, Eyraud himself did not grasp the significance of what he had found. He was a missionary, not a scholar, and his primary concern was conversion, not cultural preservation. He made no effort to collect or preserve the tablets, and he recorded no detailed description of their symbols. This failure would prove devastating, because in the years that followed Eyraud's visit, the tablets began to disappear. The disappearance of the Rongorongo tablets is one of the great tragedies of cultural heritage. Eyraud himself may have been partly responsible. Later accounts suggest that missionaries who followed him to the island, in their zeal to eradicate pagan practices, encouraged the islanders to burn or destroy objects associated with the old religion. The tablets, as sacred artifacts of the pre-Christian order, were prime targets. Some were apparently used as firewood. Others were reportedly wrapped around fishing lines as spools. Still others were used to build canoes or were simply discarded as the old ways gave way to the new. But destruction was not the only fate of the tablets. Some were collected by visitors, traders, and missionaries and taken off the island, and it is from these scattered survivors that the entire corpus of known Rongorongo texts derives. The most important collector was a Catholic bishop named Florentin Etienne Jaussen, who served as the Bishop of Tahiti. In 1868, Bishop Jaussen received a gift from the newly converted islanders of Rapanui, a length of cord wound around a spool that had been fashioned from a piece of wood covered in Rongorongo symbols. The cord was a fine piece of human hair rope, and it had been sent as a token of goodwill. but Jaussen's attention was captured not by the cord but by the spool. He immediately recognized the inscribed symbols as something potentially extraordinary, a possible writing system from an isolated Polynesian island. Jaussen was electrified. He understood the implications. If the people of Rapanui had independently developed a writing system, it would be one of only a handful of instances in all of human history where writing had been independently invented, alongside the Sumerians of Mesopotamia, the ancient Egyptians, the Chinese, the Mesoamerican civilizations, and perhaps the Indus Valley people. This would place the Rapanui among the most innovative peoples in the history of the world. Jaussen immediately sent instructions to the missionaries on Rapa Nui to collect as many tablets as possible and to find someone who could read them. He also began his own efforts to study and categorize the symbols, work that would continue for the rest of his life and that would produce some of the earliest and most important documentation of the script. The missionaries on the island responded to Jaussen's request, but their results were mixed. Some tablets were obtained, but the process was difficult. Many had already been destroyed. Others were hidden by islanders who, despite their conversion to Christianity, still valued the tablets as connections to their ancestral heritage. And the search for a living reader, someone who could actually interpret the symbols, proved to be the most frustrating endeavor of all. Bishop Jaussen's most significant attempt to find a reader of Rongorongo centered on a man named Metoro Tauyur. Metoro was a Rapanui man who had moved to Tahiti, and in 1871 or 1874, the exact date is disputed, Jaussen brought him in and asked him to read the tablets. What followed was one of the most tantalizing and frustrating episodes in the entire history of Rongorongo research. Metoro sat with the tablets and began to chant. He held the boards in his hands, turned them in various directions, and recited what appeared to be a continuous stream of words and phrases associated with the symbols he was examining. Jaussen carefully recorded everything Metoro said, creating a document that would later be known as Jaussen's Notebook or the Jaussen List, a detailed glyph-by-glyph accounting of Metoro's readings. But there was a problem. A serious, fundamental, possibly insurmountable problem. It was not clear that Metoro was actually reading the tablets. As Jaussen himself noted with growing frustration, Metoro's recitations were inconsistent. He would assign different meanings to the same symbol on different occasions. His chants, while fluent and rhythmic, did not seem to correspond in any systematic way to the sequence of glyphs on the tablets. He appeared to be improvising, drawing on a stock of traditional phrases and cultural knowledge to produce something that sounded like a reading but may not have been one. There are several possible explanations for this. One is that Metoro was a fraud, that he had no knowledge of Rongorongo at all and was simply performing for the bishop, telling him what he wanted to hear. Another is that Metoro had partial knowledge. Perhaps he recognized some symbols and knew some associated chants, but had never been fully initiated into the reading tradition and was filling in the gaps with improvisation. A third possibility suggested by some later scholars is that Metoro was actually performing correctly, that Rongorongo was not a writing system in the strict sense, but rather a mnemonic device, a set of symbols designed to prompt the memory of a trained reciter who already knew the texts by heart. In this case, Metoro's apparent inconsistencies might reflect the fact that the system was never meant to be read the way we read a book, with a fixed one-to-one correspondence between symbol and meaning. This last possibility is critically important because it touches on one of the deepest and most contentious questions in the study of Rongorongo. Is it really writing, or is it something else? But we will return to that question. For now, the point is that Metoro's readings, while valuable as cultural documents, did not provide a key to deciphering the script. Jaussen recorded the readings, compiled his lists, and continued his own analysis, but he never achieved a breakthrough. He died in 1891 with Rongorongo still unread, and Metoro's fate is equally poignant. He was, as far as we know, the last person ever to sit with the tablets and attempt to read them from a position of cultural knowledge, however incomplete. After his sessions with Jaussen, he returned to his life and eventually died without passing on whatever knowledge he possessed. When he fell silent, the last faint echo of the reading tradition fell silent with him. But Bishop Jaussen was not the only person who tried to extract the meaning of Rongorongo from the islanders themselves. In fact, there were several other attempts, all of them conducted in the narrow window between the slave raids and the complete extinction of cultural memory, and all of them produced results that were maddeningly ambiguous. One of the most notable was conducted by Paymaster William Thomson of a naval vessel who visited Easter Island in 1886. Thomson, an energetic and curious man, was determined to learn everything he could about the island and its culture during his brief stay. He obtained 2 Rongorongo tablets, a feat in itself, as the islanders were reluctant to part with them, and he sought out an elderly man named Eyraud, who was reputed to have some knowledge of the script. Eyraud was initially reluctant to cooperate. Thomson's accounts describe a man who was deeply conflicted, drawn by the desire to preserve something of the old knowledge, yet fearful of the power of the Catholic missionaries, who had forbidden the old practices. Eventually, Thomson persuaded Eyraud to examine the tablets, reportedly by plying him with alcohol and gifts. What followed was eerily similar to Metoro's performance before Bishop Jaussen. Eyraud chanted, he recited, he produced what appeared to be readings of the tablets. Thomson and his interpreter recorded what they could, but once again, the relationship between the chanted text and the carved symbols was unclear. Eyraud seemed to be reciting memorized texts that were associated with the tablets in a general way, rather than reading the symbols in a sequential, linguistic manner. Thomson's account adds another layer to the mystery. He noted that Eyraud at one point refused to continue, saying that the missionaries had forbidden it and that he feared spiritual consequences. He also reported that the old man became genuinely emotional during parts of his recitation, chanting texts that Thomson believed were creation myths, genealogies, and accounts of historical events. Whether or not Eyraud was truly reading the tablets, he was clearly accessing a deep reservoir of cultural memory, stories and traditions that had been transmitted orally through generations and that were now on the verge of disappearing forever. Thomson published his findings in a report that included illustrations of the tablets and transcriptions of Eyraud's chants. This report, published in 1891, remains one of the most important primary documents in Rongorongo research, but it did not solve the mystery. The chants, while culturally rich, could not be reliably matched to specific glyphs. The code remained unbroken. There were other informants, other attempts. Various visitors to the island in the late 19th and early 20th centuries spoke with islanders who claimed some familiarity with the tablets. The German ethnographer Karl Rautolge, who spent 17 months on Rapanui in 1914 and 1915, conducted extensive interviews with elderly islanders and compiled a significant body of cultural knowledge. But by her time, the last individuals with any direct connection to the Rongorongo tradition were very old, and their knowledge was fragmentary at best. Rautolge recorded the names of individual glyphs as remembered by her informants, and she gathered important details about the social context of the script, who used it when and for what purposes. But she, too, was unable to crack the code. By the early 20th century, the window had closed. The last informants with even a tenuous connection to the reading tradition had died. Whatever they knew, and we will never know exactly how much that was, died with them. The tablets were now truly silent. Let us now turn to the tablets themselves. What are they? What do they look like? What do the symbols depict? And what can we learn from the physical objects even if we cannot read what they say? The surviving corpus of Rongorongo consists of approximately 26 objects, depending on how you count fragments and disputed pieces. These objects are scattered across museums and collections in various countries. The largest collection is held by the Congregation of the Sacred Hearts in Rome and in the Museum of Natural History in Santiago, Chile. Others are in Berlin, Vienna, London, St. Petersburg, Washington, Honolulu, and in private hands. The fact that these precious artifacts are dispersed across the globe, far from the island where they were created, is itself a testament to the colonial dynamics that shaped their history. The objects come in several forms. Most are flat, roughly rectangular boards or tablets. Some are irregular in shape, having been carved on whatever piece of wood was available. At least one, known as the Santiago staff, is a long wooden staff approximately 4 feet in length, covered in symbols along its entire surface. Another, known as the Riemiro, is shaped like a crescent, a traditional Rapanui ornament worn around the neck. The wood from which the tablets are made has been a subject of significant research. Analysis has shown that many of the tablets are carved on driftwood wood from trees that do not grow on Easter Island and that must have washed ashore after drifting across the Pacific. Some tablets appear to have been carved on wood from the Toromiro tree, a species native to Rapa Nui that eventually went extinct in the wild on the island, though it survived in cultivation elsewhere. At least one tablet shows evidence of having been carved on a European ore, suggesting that it was created after European contact, or at least that the wood was obtained from a European ship. This detail about the wood is important because it raises the question of how old the script really is. If some tablets were carved on European wood, then those particular tablets cannot predate European contact in 1722. But does that mean the script itself was a post-contact invention? Or does it simply mean that the scribes used whatever wood was available, including salvaged foreign material, to continue a tradition that predated European arrival? This question is at the heart of one of the most contentious debates in Rongorongo scholarship, and we will explore it in detail shortly. The symbols themselves are remarkable. There are estimated to be between approximately 120 and several hundred distinct glyphs, depending on how one defines distinct, whether slight variations are counted as separate symbols or as variants of a single symbol. The glyphs are overwhelmingly figurative, meaning they depict recognizable forms rather than abstract marks. The most common images include human figures in various poses, standing, sitting, holding objects. There are birds of several types: fish, plants, geometric shapes, celestial objects, and hybrid forms that combine features of different creatures. Some figures appear to be deities or supernatural beings. Others are clearly representations of everyday objects: fish hooks, paddles, turtles, lizards. The level of detail in the carving is impressive. Individual glyphs are typically less than a centimeter tall, and they are carved with considerable precision and consistency. The lines are clean, the proportions are maintained across different tablets, and the overall aesthetic effect is one of careful craftsmanship. These were not casually scratched doodles. They were the product of a trained hand and a disciplined tradition. But the most unusual feature of Rongorongo, the feature that has fascinated and puzzled scholars more than any other, is the direction in which the text is read. The glyphs are arranged in lines that run from left to right across the surface of the tablet. But at the end of each line, the direction reverses. The next line runs from right to left, and then the next reverses again, running left to right. This would not be especially remarkable. A similar pattern, called Boustrophedon, is found in some early Greek inscriptions and other ancient scripts, but Rongorongo adds an additional twist, literally. In Rongorongo, the glyphs in alternating lines are not merely reversed in direction, but are also rotated 180 degrees, turned upside down. To read the text, one would read a line from left to right, then rotate the tablet 180 degrees to read the next line, again from left to right in the new orientation, and then rotate again, and so on. This pattern is called reverse Boustrophedon, and it is essentially unique to Rongorongo. No other known writing system in the world uses this precise arrangement. It suggests that the script was not borrowed from any other culture's writing system, because if it had been, we would expect to see the same directional pattern in the source script. The reverse Boustrophedon of Rongorongo appears to be an independent invention, a solution to the problem of text direction that no other civilization arrived at. This uniqueness is one of the strongest arguments in favor of Rongorongo being an independent invention of the Rapanui people rather than a borrowed or inspired system. And if that is the case, then the implications are profound. Independent invention of writing is one of the rarest events in human history. Depending on how you define writing and how you classify the evidence, writing appears to have been independently invented no more than 4 or 5 times in the entire span of human civilization. The Sumerians developed cuneiform in Mesopotamia around 3,400 years before the Common Era. The Egyptians developed hieroglyphics at roughly the same time, though whether this was truly independent or influenced by Sumerian precedent is debated. The Chinese developed their logographic writing system around 1,200 years before the Common Era, apparently independently. And the Mesoamerican civilizations, the Olmecs, the Maya, the Zapotecs, developed their own writing systems, also apparently independently, beginning around 600 years before the Common Era. Every other writing system in the history of the world appears to derive from one of these primary inventions, either directly or through a chain of influence and adaptation. The alphabets of Europe, the Middle East, and South Asia all trace their ancestry back to a common source. The scripts of Southeast Asia derive from Indian models. The Japanese writing system borrowed from the Chinese. The entire history of writing is, with very few exceptions, a history of one civilization learning the concept from another and adapting it to their own language. If Rongorongo is genuinely an independent invention of the Rapanui, if they developed the concept of representing language with visual symbols entirely on their own, without any knowledge of or exposure to any other writing system, then it would be one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements in human history. It would mean that this small, isolated population on a remote Pacific island achieved something that only a tiny handful of cultures ever achieved, something that the vast majority of the world's civilizations, including many large, complex, and sophisticated ones, never accomplished. But is it really independent, or could it have been inspired by European writing? This question has divided scholars for over a century, and it deserves careful examination. The case for Rongorongo being a post-contact invention, inspired by European writing but not derived from any specific European script, rests on several pieces of evidence. First, there is the chronological argument. No European visitor to Rapa Nui before 1864 described or depicted anything that looks like Rongorongo. If the script had been in widespread use for centuries, it seems odd that Cook, Roggeveen, Gonzalez, and others would have missed it entirely. The earliest concrete evidence for the existence of the script comes from Eyraud's account in 1866, describing things he observed during his stay that began in 1864. This post-contact timing has led some scholars to suggest that the script might have been invented relatively recently, perhaps in the late 18th or early 19th century. The most commonly cited scenario for post-contact inspiration is the visit of Felipe González de Ejido in 1770. When the Spanish presented their document of annexation, the Rapanui chiefs were asked to make marks on the paper. They did so, producing symbols that some scholars have interpreted as early forms of Rongorongo glyphs. The theory is that this encounter with European writing, the sight of people making marks on a surface that had communicative power, sparked the idea of creating a writing system. In this scenario, the Rapanui did not copy Spanish writing, but rather grasped the concept that meaning could be encoded in visual symbols, and then developed their own entirely original system based on that concept. There is also the evidence of the wood itself. As mentioned, several tablets are carved on driftwood or repurposed European materials, and none of the surviving tablets have been reliably dated to before European contact. If the tradition were ancient, we might expect to find older examples, tablets preserved in caves or buried in archaeological deposits. None have been found. The case for Rongorongo being a pre-contact invention, truly independent of any European influence, is also strong, however. Supporters of the pre-contact hypothesis point out that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The fact that early European visitors did not describe the script does not prove it did not exist. As we have discussed, the tablets were sacred objects kept by a priestly elite and would not have been shown to outsiders. Cook was on the island for only 4 days, Roggeveen for 1, Gonzalez for 6. These were brief visits, and the Europeans had limited access to the inner workings of Rapanui society. Furthermore, Eyraud's account in 1866 describes the tablets as being found in every house on the island, suggesting they were not rare or recent creations, but rather a long-established part of the cultural landscape. If the script had been invented only recently, say, after Gonzalez's visit in 1770, it seems unlikely that it would have become so ubiquitous in less than a century, particularly given the social upheaval of the intervening decades. The complexity and sophistication of the script also argue against a recent invention. Rongorongo has hundreds of distinct glyphs, a unique directional system, and apparent structural regularities that suggest it had been refined over time. Creating a writing system from scratch is an enormously difficult intellectual feat, and the few known cases of independent invention seem to have involved extended periods of development and experimentation. It is hard to imagine such a system springing fully formed from a brief encounter with Spanish bureaucrats. There is also the question of cultural depth. Rongorongo is deeply embedded in Rapanui culture, in its terminology, its associations with sacred practices, its integration into the social hierarchy. The Tangata Rongorongo, the specialist readers, held positions of prestige and importance. The word Rongorongo itself may derive from a term meaning to recite or to chant, suggesting a connection to oral traditions that long predated European contact. This cultural integration would be difficult to achieve in a few decades, and then there are the glyphs themselves. The symbols in Rongorongo bear no resemblance to any European script. They do not look like Latin letters or Arabic letters or any other Old World writing system. If the Rapanui were inspired by Spanish writing, they did not borrow a single visual element from it. The system they created is entirely original in its visual vocabulary. This is consistent with independent invention, but harder to reconcile with direct imitation. The debate remains unresolved. The consensus among most scholars today leans toward regarding Rongorongo as either a fully independent invention or a system whose concept may have been triggered by exposure to European writing, but whose execution was entirely original. In either case, it represents a remarkable creative achievement. But what kind of writing is it? This is perhaps the most fundamental question in Rongorongo research, and the answer, or rather, the range of possible answers, has enormous implications for whether the script can ever be deciphered. Writing systems can be classified into several broad categories based on how their symbols relate to language. Logographic systems use symbols to represent words or morphemes, the smallest meaningful units of language. Chinese is the best-known logographic system. Each character represents a word or concept, and there are thousands of characters needed to write the language fully. Syllabic systems use symbols to represent syllables. Japanese hiragana and katakana are syllabic. Each symbol represents a consonant-vowel combination. A syllabic system for a typical language might require between 50 and several hundred symbols. Alphabetic systems use symbols to represent individual sounds, consonants, and vowels. The Latin alphabet, the Arabic alphabet, and the Cyrillic alphabet are all alphabetic systems. These typically require between 20 and 40 symbols. Then there are mixed systems, which combine elements of different types like Japanese, which uses logographic characters borrowed from Chinese alongside 2 syllabic scripts. And finally, there are systems that are not writing at all in the strict linguistic sense, but rather mnemonic devices, visual aids that prompt the memory of someone who already knows a text, but do not encode language in a way that allows an untrained reader to decode it. The Quipu of the Inca Empire is sometimes cited as an example, though there is growing evidence that Quipus may encode more linguistic information than previously thought. Where does Rongorongo fall on this spectrum? The honest answer is that we do not know. The number of distinct glyphs, estimated at somewhere between 120 and 600, depending on how variants are counted, is consistent with several possibilities. If the number is on the lower end, it could be a syllabic system, which would be appropriate for the Rapanui language, a Polynesian language with a relatively simple syllable structure of consonant-vowel combinations. If the number is higher, it could be a logographic system or a mixed system. And if the relationship between symbols and language is loose and flexible, it could be a mnemonic system rather than true writing. Each of these possibilities has different implications for decipherment. A syllabic system, if correctly identified, might be crackable through statistical analysis, looking at the frequency and distribution of symbols and comparing them to the known phonological patterns of the Rapanui language. A logographic system would be much harder to crack without a bilingual text or a large corpus, and a mnemonic system might be fundamentally undecipherable because the symbols would not encode language in a way that could be recovered from the symbols alone. This uncertainty is one of the central obstacles to decipherment. Without knowing what kind of system you are dealing with, you cannot even choose the right method of attack. It is like trying to pick a lock when you do not know whether the lock uses a key, a combination, a fingerprint, or a voice command. Despite these daunting obstacles, scholars have not given up. The history of Rongorongo decipherment attempts is long, colorful, and occasionally tragicomic. It is a history populated by brilliant minds and crackpots, by rigorous methodologists and wild speculators, by humble experts and self-proclaimed geniuses. And it is a history in which, despite enormous effort, genuine progress has been agonizingly slow. The first serious scholarly treatment of Rongorongo came from Bishop Jaussen himself, who compiled a catalogue of glyphs and attempted to assign meanings based on Metoro's readings. His work was pioneering but ultimately inconclusive. Metoro's readings, as we have discussed, were inconsistent and unreliable, and Jaussen himself recognized that he had not achieved a true decipherment. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, several European scholars attempted to analyze the script. The British researcher Alfred Matrox conducted extensive anthropological fieldwork on Rapanui in the 1930s and devoted considerable attention to Rongorongo, though his conclusions were cautious and he ultimately declined to claim a decipherment. The Hungarian scholar Guillaume de Hevesy created a sensation in 1932 when he published a paper claiming to find striking similarities between Rongorongo glyphs and the symbols of the Indus Valley script, the undeciphered writing system of the ancient Harappan civilization of South Asia. Hevesy argued that this similarity proved a historical connection between the two cultures, perhaps through migration or cultural diffusion across the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Hevesy's claims were dramatic and captured public attention, but they were quickly and thoroughly debunked by other scholars. The similarities he identified were superficial and could be explained by chance. When you have two large sets of simple pictographic symbols, some are bound to look alike. Birds look like birds, fish look like fish, human figures look like human figures. The supposed connections between the Indus Valley script and Rongorongo dissolved under close examination, and Hevesy's theory was relegated to the category of interesting but unfounded speculation. Other early attempts were similarly unsuccessful. Some scholars tried to read Rongorongo as a form of ancient Egyptian. Others saw connections to Chinese characters. Still others claimed it was a record of astronomical observations, a mathematical notation, or a musical score. None of these theories produced consistent, verifiable results. None of them could explain the full range of glyphs and their patterns across multiple tablets. The mid-20th century saw the emergence of more rigorous analytical approaches. The German linguist Thomas Barthel published a monumental study of Rongorongo in 1958, titled Grundlagen zur Entzifferung der Osterinselschrift, Foundations for the Decipherment of the Easter Island Script. Barthel's work was the most comprehensive analysis of the script to date. He created a standardized catalog of glyphs numbering each distinct symbol. He analyzed the structure and organization of the texts. He attempted to identify grammatical patterns, and he proposed partial readings of some sections, particularly those he believed to be calendrical or genealogical in nature. Barthel's work was groundbreaking and remains influential, but it was also controversial. His proposed readings relied heavily on assumptions about the nature of the script and its relationship to the Rapanui language, and these assumptions were not universally accepted. Other scholars challenged his methodology, his glyph identifications, and his interpretations. The debates were sometimes heated and occasionally personal, reflecting the intense passions that Rongorongo inspires in those who study it. One of the most significant developments in Rongorongo research came in the 1990s, when a linguist named Stephen Roger Fischer announced that he had achieved a partial decipherment of the script. Fischer's work focused on a specific tablet known as the Santiago staff, and he proposed that much of the text on this and other tablets followed a specific structural pattern. A three-part formula consisting of a subject, a verb, and an object, often involving the copulation of a deity with a natural element to produce a specific outcome. Fischer argued that the tablets were creation chants, cosmogonic texts describing how the gods brought the world into being through acts of procreation. Fischer's claims generated enormous excitement in the scholarly community and in the popular press. Here at last was someone offering not just a theory about Rongorongo but an actual reading, specific, testable, translatable. But the excitement was short-lived. Other scholars quickly challenged Fischer's work, pointing out methodological problems, questioning his glyph identifications, and arguing that his proposed readings were not consistent across different tablets. The linguistic structure he identified, a rigid three-part formula, seemed too simple and too repetitive to account for the full range of variation in the texts, and his reliance on Metoro's readings, which he used as a starting point for his own work, was seen by some as building on an unreliable foundation. Fischer defended his work vigorously, and the debate continued for years. But the consensus among most Rongorongo scholars is that Fischer's decipherment, while interesting and provocative, has not been conclusively demonstrated. It remains one hypothesis among many, and the script remains officially undeciphered. While the quest for a full decipherment has remained elusive, there is one area where genuine, widely accepted progress has been made. It involves a specific structural feature found on one particular tablet, and it offers a tantalizing glimpse of what Rongorongo might contain. The tablet in question is known as Tablet C, or the Mamari tablet. It is one of the better preserved tablets, with a large number of clearly legible glyphs arranged in neat rows. And on one section of this tablet, there is a sequence of glyphs that has been convincingly identified as a lunar calendar. The identification was made independently by several researchers and is based on a simple but powerful observation. In this section of the tablet, there is a repeating sequence of crescent-shaped glyphs that vary systematically. Some are thin crescents, some are thicker, some are full circles, and they appear to follow a pattern that corresponds to the phases of the moon. The sequence progresses from new moon to full moon and back again, with each phase represented by a glyph whose shape mirrors the appearance of the moon at that stage of its cycle. If this identification is correct, and most scholars believe it is, then this section of the Mamari tablet is a lunar calendar, a record of the passage of months defined by the cycle of the moon. It tells us that the Rapanui were tracking time systematically and recording their observations in their script. It tells us that at least some of the tablets had a practical, administrative function, keeping track of the calendar, perhaps coordinating agricultural activities or ritual observances with the phases of the moon. But the lunar calendar section is only a small part of one tablet. It does not help us read the rest of the text on that tablet or any other tablet. It is a single solved puzzle in a vast room full of unsolved ones. And the method by which it was solved, recognizing a visual correspondence between the shape of the glyphs and the shape of the moon, cannot be easily extended to other parts of the script, where the relationship between symbol and meaning is not so visually obvious. Still, the lunar calendar is proof of concept. It demonstrates that the symbols on the tablets do encode specific, meaningful information. It demonstrates that the script is not random decoration but a purposeful system of communication. And it gives us hope that other sections of the tablets may eventually yield to analysis. We must now confront a question that has been lurking beneath the surface of this entire discussion. What were the tablets for? Even if we cannot read their specific contents, can we determine their general purpose from context, from the testimony of informants, and from structural analysis? The evidence, fragmentary as it is, points in several directions. First, there is the testimony of informants. The various Rapanui individuals who spoke to missionaries, explorers, and ethnographers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries provided scattered and sometimes contradictory information about the purpose of the tablets. Some said the tablets contained genealogies, lists of ancestors tracing the descent of important families from the founding settlers of the island. Others said they contained hymns to the gods, creation myths, or accounts of historical events. Still others described them as records of wars, treaties, or crimes, and some informants said they contained lists of the dead, records of people who had died, perhaps in specific events or during specific periods. These diverse descriptions may not be contradictory. If the Rapanui had a writing system, they probably used it for multiple purposes, just as every other literate civilization has done. A single culture can produce religious texts, historical chronicles, legal documents, astronomical records, and poetry, all using the same script. There is no reason to expect that all Rongorongo tablets would have the same type of content. Second, there is the structural evidence. Scholars who have analyzed the distribution of glyphs across different tablets have noticed patterns that are consistent with certain types of content. Some tablets show high degrees of repetition, with the same sequences of glyphs appearing again and again with slight variations. This pattern is consistent with chants, litanies, or calendrical records where repetition is a structural feature of the content. Other tablets show less repetition and more variation, which might indicate narrative texts or lists of distinct items. Third, there is the cultural context. The Rapanui, like other Polynesian peoples, placed enormous importance on genealogy. Knowing one's lineage, being able to recite the names of one's ancestors back through many generations to the original settlers and ultimately to the gods, was not merely a matter of family pride, but of political and spiritual legitimacy. The Eyraud, the paramount chief, derived his authority from his genealogical connection to the gods, and the ability to recite and verify these genealogies was a crucial social function. It is plausible, even likely, that some of the tablets contained genealogical records. Similarly, the Rapanui had a rich tradition of cosmogonic chanting, creation narratives describing how the world came into being, how the gods shaped the land and sea, how the first ancestors arrived on the island. These chants were performed at important ceremonies and were considered sacred. Some researchers, including Fischer, have argued that the tablets contain these creation chants. And then there is the count. The confirmed lunar calendar on the Mamari tablet tells us that at least some tablets served a practical timekeeping function. The Rapanui, like many agricultural and seafaring peoples, needed to track the passage of seasons, the phases of the moon, and the timing of important events. A writing system could serve this need admirably. But beyond these general categories, the specific content of the tablets remains unknown. We can speculate, we can hypothesize, but we cannot read. And until someone finds a way to crack the code, to establish a reliable correspondence between the glyphs and the language they represent, the tablets will continue to guard their secrets. Let us consider for a moment what it would mean if the tablets could be read. What would we learn? What knowledge has been locked away in those carved wooden boards for over a century? We might learn the history of the Rapanui people from their own perspective, not as told by European explorers, missionaries, and anthropologists, but as recorded by the Rapanui themselves. We might learn how they understood their own origins, how they remembered their ancestors' epic voyage across the Pacific, what they thought about their place in the world. We might learn the names of chiefs and warriors and priests who lived and died centuries ago, people who built the Moai and performed the ceremonies and navigated by the stars, people whose names are now lost to history. We might learn what happened on the island before European contact, the internal dynamics that shaped Rapanui society through the centuries. The archaeological record tells us that the island underwent significant environmental change, with extensive deforestation that transformed the landscape and may have contributed to social upheaval. But the archaeological record is silent on the human experience of these changes. The tablets might tell us how the Rapanui understood and responded to the ecological transformation of their island. They might tell us about conflicts, about solutions, about adaptations. We might learn about the Moai, not just how they were built and transported, but why. We might learn the names of the statues, the identities of the ancestors they represent, the ceremonies that accompanied their creation and erection. We might learn the meaning of the symbols carved on some of the Moai's backs, which may be related to Rongorongo. We might learn about the religion of the Rapanui, their gods, their rituals, their spiritual beliefs. We might learn the full text of the creation chants that Metoro and Eyraud only partially and imperfectly recited. We might learn the theology behind the Birdman cult, the cosmological framework that made sense of the world for the people of this small island. We might learn things we cannot even anticipate, information about navigation, astronomy, medicine, agriculture, social organization, law, art, philosophy. Every time a lost script is deciphered, the results are surprising. When Egyptian hieroglyphics were decoded in the 1820s, when Sumerian cuneiform was cracked in the 19th century, when the Maya script was finally read in the 20th century, each decipherment revealed a world far richer, more complex, and more human than anyone had imagined. The same would almost certainly be true of Rongorongo, or we might learn something much simpler, something unexpected, and perhaps even disappointing. The tablets might turn out to be repetitive ritual chants, or lists of names, or calendrical tables, or inventories of goods. Not every ancient text is a revelation. Not every inscription is a lost masterpiece. Some are the equivalent of grocery lists and tax records. But even grocery lists and tax records from Rapanui would be extraordinary, because they would come from one of the most isolated and remarkable civilizations in human history, and they would give us a window into daily life that no other source can provide. The point is this: we do not know what the tablets contain. We may never know. And that uncertainty is itself a kind of tragedy, a reminder that knowledge, once lost, may be lost forever. The question of why Rongorongo has resisted decipherment for so long, when other scripts have been cracked, is worth examining in detail, because it reveals fundamental truths about how writing systems work and how they are decoded. Consider the most famous decipherment in history, Jean-François Champollion's reading of Egyptian hieroglyphics in 1822. Champollion succeeded because he had an extraordinary advantage: the Rosetta Stone. This single artifact, discovered in 1799, contained the same text written in 3 scripts: hieroglyphics, Demotic Egyptian, and Ancient Greek. Since scholars could read Greek, they could use the Greek text as a guide to decode the Egyptian scripts. The Rosetta Stone was, in essence, a bilingual key, a bridge between a known language and an unknown one. The decipherment of Sumerian cuneiform followed a similar pattern. Scholars began with Old Persian cuneiform, which was partially understood, and used bilingual inscriptions to work their way into Babylonian and Sumerian. The Maya script was cracked through a combination of bilingual texts, linguistic analysis of surviving Maya languages, and the brilliant insights of scholars like Yuri Norizov and his successors. The process took over a century, but it was aided by several crucial advantages. The Maya script encoded a known family of languages that are still spoken today. There was a large corpus of inscriptions to work with, and there were some colonial-era documents that provided partial keys. In every case of successful decipherment, certain conditions were met. There was either a bilingual text, a related known script, a large corpus, or a known language that could be matched to the script. Often, several of these conditions were present simultaneously. Rongorongo has almost none of these advantages. There is no bilingual text. No one has ever found a Rongorongo inscription accompanied by a translation in any other script. There is no related known script. Rongorongo appears to be unique, unrelated to any other writing system in the world. The corpus is tiny, 26 objects, many of them fragmentary, containing a total of perhaps 15,000 glyphs. Compare this to the thousands of Egyptian inscriptions or the thousands of Maya texts. The Rongorongo corpus is so small that statistical analysis is severely limited, and while the Rapanui language is still spoken, a small but dedicated community of speakers maintains it to this day. We do not know for certain that the script encodes the Rapanui language as it is currently spoken. Languages change over time. If the script was created centuries ago, the language it records may differ from modern Rapanui in ways that are difficult to predict. These obstacles, taken together, make Rongorongo one of the most difficult decipherment challenges in the world. It is not impossible that someone will eventually crack the code, but the path to decipherment will require either a lucky discovery, a new tablet, a bilingual text, a forgotten document that provides a key, or a methodological breakthrough that allows scholars to extract meaning from the existing corpus using new analytical techniques. And it is here that we must speak of the modern era of Rongorongo research, which has been shaped by the same technologies that are transforming every other field of human inquiry: computers, databases, and artificial intelligence. Beginning in the late 20th century, scholars began using computational methods to analyze the Rongorongo corpus. The first step was digitization, creating high-quality photographs, drawings, and digital models of every known tablet, glyph by glyph. This work, painstaking and meticulous, has produced detailed catalogs that allow researchers to compare glyphs across different tablets with unprecedented precision. With the corpus digitized, researchers have applied statistical analysis to look for patterns that might be invisible to the naked eye. They have calculated the frequency of individual glyphs, looking for distributions that match the known frequency patterns of syllabic or logographic systems. They have searched for repeated sequences that might represent common words or phrases. They have mapped the co-occurrence patterns of glyphs, trying to identify grammatical structures, which symbols tend to appear together, which precede or follow others. These analyses have produced some intriguing results. The frequency distribution of Rongorongo glyphs is broadly consistent with a logosyllabic writing system, a system that uses a mix of logograms, symbols representing whole words, and syllabic signs, symbols representing syllables. This is similar to many known writing systems, including Sumerian cuneiform and the Maya script. The pattern of repetition and variation across the corpus is also consistent with real linguistic text, rather than purely decorative or mnemonic arrangements. But statistical analysis can only take you so far. It can tell you that a set of symbols probably represents language. It can suggest what kind of system is being used, but it cannot tell you what the symbols mean. For that, you need external evidence, a bilingual text, a known context, or some other anchor that connects the symbols to specific meanings. In recent years, researchers have begun exploring the use of artificial intelligence, specifically machine learning and natural language processing, to attack the Rongorongo problem. The idea is that advanced algorithms, trained on large datasets of known writing systems, might be able to identify structural patterns in the script that human analysts have missed. Some researchers have used neural networks to analyze the visual features of glyphs, attempting to identify systematic relationships between glyph form and glyph function. Others have applied techniques from computational linguistics to model the possible phonological structure of the underlying language. These efforts are still in their early stages, and no AI has achieved a breakthrough. the fundamental problem remains. Without external evidence to anchor the analysis, even the most sophisticated algorithm is working in a vacuum. You can identify patterns all day, but unless you can connect those patterns to known meanings, you are not reading, you are just counting. This does not mean that AI will never contribute to the decipherment of Rongorongo. It means that the challenge is deeper than pattern recognition. It is a problem of meaning, and meaning requires context. Until new evidence is found, a new tablet, a forgotten document, an archaeological discovery that provides a key, the smartest computer in the world will be just as baffled as the smartest human. Let us pause here and consider a broader question. Why does Rongorongo matter? Why should anyone care about 26 wooden boards covered in symbols that no one can read from a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific? The answer, we believe, has to do with what Rongorongo represents, not just as an artifact, but as a symbol. Rongorongo is a reminder that the world we inhabit, the world of the 21st century, is built on the ruins of countless other worlds. Before us, there were civilizations that rose and flourished and fell, each with its own knowledge, its own wisdom, its own understanding of the universe. Some of that knowledge was preserved and passed on. Much of it was lost, and every time a piece of knowledge is lost, every time a language dies, every time a tradition is broken, every time a people are scattered and their records are destroyed, the total store of human wisdom diminishes. We are all made poorer by these losses, even if we do not know what we have lost. Rongorongo is one of those losses. Whatever the tablets contain, history, mythology, astronomy, genealogy, calendars, poetry, philosophy, or something we cannot even categorize, it was the product of human minds grappling with the challenges of existence on a remote island in the vastness of the Pacific. It was knowledge earned through centuries of observation, reflection, and creative effort. And it was destroyed not by time or entropy, but by human action, by slavers and diseases, and the deliberate suppression of indigenous culture. This loss is irreversible. Even if the script is someday deciphered, the full context of Rapanui literacy, the oral traditions that accompanied the readings, the rituals that surrounded the tablets, the social structures that supported the literate class, is gone. The tablets are orphans. They have been separated from the world that gave them meaning, and even if we can reconstruct the words, we may never fully reconstruct the world. But the attempt matters. The attempt to understand, to preserve, to decode, to remember, it matters. It is an act of respect for the people who created these objects. It is an acknowledgement that their knowledge had value. And it is a statement of hope, hope that even across the centuries, even across the vast gulf of cultural destruction, a connection can be made. The island itself has changed dramatically since the heyday of the Rongorongo scribes. The Rapanui of today bears only a faint resemblance to the Rapanui of 1,000 years ago. The forests that once covered the island are gone, cut down over centuries for agriculture, construction, and the transport of Moai. Giant palms, the Toromiro trees, the hawhouse and the mahutes, most of them vanished long before the Europeans arrived. The landscape that greets visitors today is one of rolling grassland, rocky coasts, and the silent, brooding presence of the Moai, many of which were toppled during a period of internal conflict in the 18th and 19th centuries and have been re-erected in modern times. The population has recovered somewhat from its nadir of 111 in 1877. Today, several thousand people live on the island, a mix of indigenous Rapanui and settlers from the mainland. The Rapanui language is still spoken, though it is classified as endangered. Efforts are underway to revitalize it, to teach it to young people, and to preserve it for future generations. The cultural heritage of the island, the Moai, the Ahu, the rock art, the oral traditions, is recognized as a treasure of global significance, and the island was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1995. But Rongorongo occupies a unique and painful place in the cultural landscape of modern Rapanui. The tablets are the physical embodiment of a lost inheritance. They are proof that the ancestors possessed something remarkable, a writing system, a body of encoded knowledge, a level of intellectual achievement that sets Rapanui apart from every other Polynesian culture and from most cultures in the world. and yet that inheritance cannot be claimed because its key has been lost. The tablets are like locked treasure chests. You can hold them, you can marvel at them, but you cannot open them. For the modern Rapanui people, this is more than an academic puzzle. It is a personal and cultural wound. The loss of Rongorongo is part of a larger pattern of dispossession and cultural destruction that began with the slave raids of 1862 and continued through decades of colonial rule, land seizure, and forced assimilation. The tablets, scattered across museums in foreign countries, are symbols of everything that was taken, and the inability to read them is a daily reminder of the depth of the loss. There have been efforts in recent years to repatriate the tablets, to return them to Rapanui, where they belong. These efforts have met with mixed success. Museums are often reluctant to surrender artifacts from their collections, citing concerns about conservation and scholarly access. The debates around repatriation are complex and politically charged, touching on issues of cultural sovereignty, colonial legacy, and the ownership of knowledge. But beneath the politics, there is a simple truth. These objects were made by Rapanui hands, carved with Rapanui symbols, encoded with Rapanui knowledge. They belong to the Rapanui people, and the fact that they are held in institutions thousands of miles from the island where they were created is itself a kind of injustice, a continuation of the pattern of extraction and appropriation that has defined the island's relationship with the outside world for over 2 centuries. Let us return, as we near the conclusion of this first part, to the tablets themselves. Let us think about them not as problems to be solved or artifacts to be catalogued, but as objects, physical things made of wood, carved with tools held in human hands. Imagine the person who made one of these tablets. Imagine them sitting in a stone house or in the shade of a tree, holding a piece of driftwood that had washed ashore after drifting for thousands of miles across the ocean. Imagine them picking up an obsidian flake, volcanic glass, black and razor sharp, and beginning to carve. Line by line, glyph by glyph, they inscribed the symbols onto the wood: a bird, a fish, a human figure with arms raised, a crescent moon, a geometric form whose meaning we cannot guess. Each glyph was carved with precision and care. Each line was aligned with the one before it. The whole surface of the tablet was planned, organized, executed. This was not casual doodling. This was a deliberate, skilled act of creation, the production of a document that was meant to preserve something, to communicate something, to carry meaning across time. Who was this person? What was their name? What was their role in society? Were they a priest, a scribe, a chief? Were they old or young? Were they alone or surrounded by students watching and learning? Did they chant as they carved, sounding out the words that each glyph represented? Or did they work in silence, their concentration unbroken, their hands steady? We will never know. The carvers of Rongorongo are as anonymous as the authors of cave paintings. We have their work, but we do not have them. They lived and died on a small island in the Pacific, and the world barely noticed. Their names were never recorded in any book that has survived. Their faces were never painted or photographed. They are ghosts, visible only through the marks they left on pieces of wood. And yet those marks endure. Despite everything, despite the slave raids, the diseases, the burnings, the neglect, the centuries of wind and salt and time, 26 tablets survive. They sit in museum cases behind glass or in storage rooms wrapped in acid-free tissue, carefully maintained by conservators who handle them with cotton gloves. The glyphs are still sharp, the lines are still clear. The birds still have their beaks, the fish still have their fins, the human figures still raise their arms in gestures whose meaning we cannot interpret. They are waiting. They have been waiting for over 150 years. They have been waiting for someone to come along and hear what they have to say. Perhaps that person has not yet been born. Perhaps the key to Rongorongo lies not in any technique currently known, but in some future development, a discovery, an insight, a method that we cannot yet imagine. The history of decipherment is full of surprises. The Maya script was considered permanently undecipherable for decades before a series of breakthroughs in the mid-20th century opened it up. Egyptian hieroglyphics were a mystery for over 1,000 years before Champollion cracked them in a matter of months. The impossible becomes possible, silence becomes speech, or perhaps the tablets will never be read. Perhaps the chain of knowledge was broken too completely, the evidence too meager, the gulf between the symbols and their meaning too wide to bridge. Perhaps the silence of Rongorongo is permanent, a forever mystery, a question that will never receive an answer. Either way, the tablets matter. Either way, they speak to us not in words, but in their mere existence. They tell us that in this remote place, on this small island, surrounded by the vastness of the sea, human beings created something extraordinary. They tell us that the impulse to record, to preserve, to communicate across time is one of the deepest and most universal of human drives. They tell us that even in the most isolated circumstances, human creativity can flourish, can innovate, can produce things that astonish the world. And they tell us one more thing. They tell us that what can be created can also be destroyed, that knowledge is fragile, that civilizations are mortal, that the things we build and the things we know can be taken from us in an instant by violence or by indifference, and once they are gone, they may be gone forever. This is the lesson of Rongorongo. It is carved in wood and written in silence, and it is addressed to all of us, but the story is far from over. In the second part of this documentary, we will go deeper. We will examine each of the major surviving tablets in detail, their physical characteristics, their provenance, their unique features. We will explore the most promising recent theories about the script's structure and meaning. We will meet the contemporary scholars who have devoted their careers to the Rongorongo puzzle and hear their insights, their frustrations, and their hopes. We will examine the cutting-edge computational and linguistic techniques being applied to the problem today. We will explore the cultural and political dimensions of the Rongorongo question, the debates over ownership, access, and the rights of indigenous peoples to their own heritage. And we will ask the ultimate question, will Rongorongo ever be read? And if so, what will we find? The tablets are waiting. The mystery endures. The silence speaks, if only we can learn to listen. For now, let us sit with the mystery. Let us hold it in our minds the way the scribes of Rapanui held their obsidian flakes, carefully, reverently, aware that we are touching something precious, something fragile, something that connects us to people we will never meet and a world we will never see. The story of Rongorongo is, in the end, a story about us, about what we value, what we preserve, what we destroy, and what we remember. And in a world where knowledge is produced and consumed at a pace that would have been unimaginable to the carvers of Rapa Nui, it is worth pausing to remember that some knowledge, once lost, may never be recovered, that some silences are permanent, and that the 26 wooden tablets of Easter Island with their tiny carved birds and fish and human figures may contain answers to questions we have not yet learned to ask. That is the mystery, that is the tragedy. And that is the wonder of Rongorongo, the physical reality of the tablets themselves, their textures, their dimensions, their states of preservation, tell stories that supplement the inscriptions we cannot yet read. Consider, for example, the tablet known to researchers by different letter designations assigned by Thomas Barthel in his comprehensive catalogue. Each tablet has both a letter designation and a common name, and some have multiple names depending on which scholar or institution has described them. This nomenclature itself reflects the fragmented, internationalized nature of Rongorongo scholarship, a field in which objects, experts, and publications are scattered across multiple continents and languages. Among the most important tablets is the one known as Tahua, which is one of the largest and best preserved examples. This tablet, held in a collection far from Easter Island, is a substantial piece of wood, dark with age and handling, its surface dense with glyphs. Every inch of available space has been used. The carver filled the board with symbols, leaving almost no blank areas, as if the wood were precious, which it almost certainly was, on an island where trees had become increasingly scarce, and every available surface needed to be utilized. The Tahua tablet contains over 1,500 glyphs, making it one of the most text-rich objects in the corpus. Its symbols are well-formed and regular, suggesting the hand of an experienced scribe. The reverse Boustrophedon pattern is clearly visible, lines of glyphs running in alternating directions, with the figures in alternate lines inverted relative to their neighbors. The effect, when you look at the whole tablet, is mesmerizing. a dense field of tiny figures marching across the wood in opposite directions, like armies passing each other on a road, each row a mirror image of the one before it, flipped upside down and reversed. What does the tahua contain? We do not know. Statistical analysis suggests that its text is not purely repetitive. It has enough variation to suggest narrative or discursive content rather than a simple list or chant. But without a key, the specifics remain hidden. Then there is the Aruku-Kurenga tablet, another substantial piece, notable for the clarity and beauty of its carving. The glyphs on this tablet are particularly fine, delicate, precise, almost calligraphic in their execution. Whoever carved this board was not merely literate but artistically skilled, capable of producing miniature figures that are at once legible and aesthetically pleasing. And there is the Katie tablet, which has a distinctive feature that has attracted much scholarly attention. A section where the glyphs appear to be organized differently from the rest of the text, with symbols arranged in a pattern that some researchers have interpreted as a structured list or table rather than continuous text. If this interpretation is correct, it might indicate that this section contains a catalog of some kind, a list of names, a roster of objects, a taxonomy of natural phenomena. These and other tablets present an endlessly fascinating array of details for scholars to study. Every new examination, every new photograph, every new analysis reveals nuances that previous generations of researchers may have missed. The wood grain beneath the carving, the depth and angle of the incised lines, the places where the carver's tool slipped or was redirected, the evidence of use wear on the surfaces, suggesting that the tablets were handled frequently, perhaps held during recitations. The traces of pigment in some of the incised lines, indicating that the carvings may have been painted or highlighted with natural dyes, red ochre perhaps, or the soot black of charcoal. Each of these details adds to our understanding of how the tablets were made and used, even if they do not tell us what the symbols mean. They are clues, tiny fragments of evidence, and they are all we have. We should also consider the Santiago staff, which is unique among the Rongorongo artifacts. It is not a flat tablet, but a cylindrical staff, approximately 126 centimeters long, covered along its entire length with rows of glyphs. The staff contains over 2,400 glyphs, making it the single most text-rich object in the entire corpus. Its shape and size suggest it was a ceremonial object, perhaps a staff of office carried by a chief or priest, a symbol of authority that also served as a repository of sacred text. The Santiago staff was one of the objects at the center of Stephen Roger Fischer's proposed decipherment. Fischer argued that the text on the staff follows a repetitive formula that he identified as a creation chant, with each unit of text describing the coupling of a deity with a natural element to produce a specific outcome. Fischer's analysis was detailed and systematic, and he presented his findings with confidence. But as we have discussed, his work was challenged by other scholars, and the debate remains unresolved. Whether or not Fischer's specific reading is correct, the Santiago staff remains one of the most important and enigmatic objects in the corpus. Its length, its density of text, its ceremonial form, all of these features suggest that it contains a text of particular significance. If any single object in the Rongorongo corpus contains the kind of sustained narrative or structured composition that would be most informative for decipherment, the Santiago staff is a prime candidate. There is another dimension of the Rongorongo mystery that deserves attention, and it concerns not the tablets themselves, but the broader question of Polynesian intellectual culture. The Rapanui were Polynesians. They spoke a Polynesian language, practiced Polynesian customs, and descended from Polynesian navigators. And yet no other Polynesian culture developed a writing system. The Hawaiians had no script, the Maori had no script, the Tahitians, the Tongans, the Samoans, the Marquesans, none of them developed writing before European contact. In all of Polynesia, only the Rapanui appear to have made this extraordinary cognitive leap. Why? What was different about Rapa Nui? What conditions existed on this particular island that fostered the invention of writing? One possible answer is isolation itself. Rapanui is the most isolated inhabited island in the Pacific. Its people were cut off from the rest of Polynesia to a degree that no other Polynesian culture experienced. This isolation meant that they could not rely on inter-island trade, communication, or migration to maintain connections with distant relatives and cultural partners. They were on their own, facing the challenges of survival with only the resources and knowledge they possessed. In this context, writing might have served a crucial function: the preservation and transmission of knowledge across generations without the support of a broader cultural network. In less isolated Polynesian societies, knowledge could be maintained through inter-island exchanges, visiting priests, traveling genealogists, cultural festivals that brought people from different islands together to share stories and traditions. On Rapa Nui, these networks were absent. The island's knowledge had to be self-contained, self-sustaining, self-renewing. A writing system which fixes knowledge in a permanent physical form and makes it available for future generations to consult would have been an extraordinarily valuable tool in this context. This is speculative, of course. We do not know why the Rapanui developed writing and other Polynesians did not. But the isolation hypothesis is compelling, and it aligns with what we know about the conditions under which writing has been invented elsewhere. Writing tends to emerge in societies that need to manage complex information over time: large-scale agricultural planning, long-distance trade, centralized political administration. On Rapa Nui, the complexity may have been not administrative but cultural: the need to preserve a rich body of tradition in the absence of external reinforcement. Another hypothesis suggests that the development of the Moai, the enormous statues, may have been a contributing factor. The construction and transport of the Moai required sophisticated planning, coordination, and resource management. The carving of hundreds of statues, each weighing many tons, each destined for a specific location, each representing a specific ancestor, required a system of record-keeping that went beyond what oral tradition alone could comfortably manage. Writing might have emerged as a tool for managing this monumental enterprise. Yet another hypothesis proposes that the competitive dynamics of Rapanui society drove the development of writing. The island was divided into several competing clans, each with its own territory, its own ahu, its own moai. Competition among clans for prestige and resources was intense, and one of the primary arenas of competition was genealogical, the ability to demonstrate the longest, most impressive lineage, the closest connection to the founding ancestors and the gods. In this competitive environment, a clan that could produce a written record of its genealogy would have had a significant advantage over rivals who relied solely on oral tradition, which was vulnerable to challenge and dispute. Writing would have been a weapon in the ongoing struggle for prestige. These hypotheses are not mutually exclusive. All of them may contain elements of truth. And all of them point to the same conclusion: the development of writing on Rapa Nui was not a random accident or a frivolous luxury. It was a response to real needs, a practical and intellectual tool that served important social functions. And its loss in the catastrophe of the 19th century was correspondingly devastating. Before we conclude this first part, let us take a moment to consider the emotional weight of this story. We have been speaking in terms of scholarship and analysis, of glyphs and statistics and hypotheses. But Rongorongo is not merely an academic problem. It is a human story, a story of creation and destruction, of achievement and loss, of voices silenced and knowledge extinguished. Think of the Tangata Rongorongo, the men who could read the tablets. They were the custodians of their people's knowledge, the keepers of the sacred texts, the links between past and future. They had trained for years, perhaps decades, to master the script. They knew the meaning of every glyph, the content of every tablet, the proper way to chant the texts. They were the librarians, the historians, the theologians, and the scientists of their culture, all rolled into one. And in December of 1862, they were herded onto ships by armed men, taken across the sea to a foreign land, and worked to death in hellish conditions. They died far from home, surrounded by strangers, in a place where no one knew their language, their stories, or their names. And with their deaths, the library they carried in their minds was destroyed more thoroughly than if it had been burned. A burned library can sometimes be reconstructed from copies. A destroyed mind cannot. This is not ancient history. This is recent. 1862 is not the distant past. It is within the span of a few human lifetimes. The great-great-grandparents of people alive today might have known some of those who were taken. The memory of the slave raids is still alive on Rapanui, passed down through oral tradition, a wound that has not fully healed. And the tablets sit in their museum cases, silent as tombs, waiting for someone to give them back their voice. This is the story of Rongorongo. This is its first chapter. In the next part, we will go deeper still into the science, the controversy, the hope, and the heartbreak of the ongoing quest to read the last words of a lost world. The mystery continues. The silence endures, but the search, the human, stubborn, beautiful search for meaning in the marks on the wood, that search goes on. The Pacific Ocean holds its secrets well. It is the largest single feature on the surface of our planet, covering more area than all the land on Earth combined. Its depths are unfathomable, its distances incomprehensible. To stand on the shore of Rapa Nui and look outward in any direction is to confront infinity, an unbroken circle of water and sky that extends to the very edge of the world. It was across this infinity that the ancestors of the Rapanui people sailed, carrying with them the seeds of a civilization. And it is within this infinity that the meaning of their written words now seems lost, adrift, unreachable, somewhere beyond the horizon of our understanding. But the search has not ended. It has never ended. From the moment the outside world became aware that those strange carved boards existed, there have been individuals, scholars, dreamers, obsessives, geniuses, and amateurs who have refused to accept that the silence of Rongorongo is permanent. They have dedicated years, decades, entire careers to the pursuit of a breakthrough. They have argued with each other, challenged each other's methods, published papers and counter-papers, and returned again and again to the same 26 objects, looking for the one insight, the one pattern, the one key that might unlock the mystery. This second part of our story is about that search. It is about the people who have conducted it, the methods they have used, the discoveries they have made, and the questions that remain. It is about what we know, what we think we know, what we do not know, and what we may never know. And it is about the island itself, the place where the tablets were born, the place that gave them meaning, and the place that lost them. Let us begin where we left off, with the tablets themselves, examined more closely, more carefully, with the eye of someone searching for the smallest clue. When a scholar sits down to study a Rongorongo tablet, they do not simply look at the glyphs and try to guess what they mean. The process is far more systematic, far more painstaking, and far more humbling than that. It begins with documentation, the precise, exhaustive recording of every physical detail of the artifact. The first task is to produce an accurate rendering of the glyphs. This sounds straightforward, but it is anything but. The carvings are tiny. Most individual glyphs are less than a centimeter in height. They are incised into wood that may be dark, cracked, warped, or worn. The lines of the carving may be shallow or deep, sharp or eroded. In some cases, the wood grain runs in a direction that makes certain lines difficult to distinguish from natural features of the material. And the three-dimensional nature of the carving, the way the incised lines catch light differently depending on the angle, means that a photograph taken from one angle may reveal details that are invisible from another. For this reason, scholars have employed a range of documentation techniques over the years. Early researchers relied on hand drawings, which were inherently subjective. Different artists might interpret the same glyph differently. Later rubbing techniques were used, similar to brass rubbing, where paper is placed over the carving and a crayon or pencil is rubbed across the surface to capture the raised and incised areas. This produces a more objective record, but it can also miss fine details and may risk damaging fragile surfaces. In more recent decades, high-resolution photography, macro photography, and photographic techniques using raking light light directed at a very low angle across the surface, which makes incised lines stand out as shadows, have dramatically improved the quality of documentation. And most recently, three-dimensional scanning technologies, including structured light scanning and photogrammetry, have been applied to some tablets, producing digital models that can be rotated, zoomed, and examined from any angle on a computer screen. These digital models preserve not just the visual appearance of the glyphs, but the actual three-dimensional geometry of the carvings, the depth, width, and cross-sectional profile of every incised line. This level of documentation is crucial because it allows researchers who may never have the opportunity to examine the original tablets in person to study them in extraordinary detail. Given that the tablets are scattered across museums on multiple continents and that access to the originals is often restricted, digital documentation has democratized Rongorongo research to a significant degree. A scholar working anywhere in the world can now study high-quality images and models of the tablets, compare glyphs across different objects, and conduct analyses that would previously have required extensive travel and negotiation with museum curators. But documentation is only the beginning. Once the glyphs have been recorded, the real work starts: analysis. The analysis of Rongorongo proceeds along several parallel tracks, each addressing a different aspect of the script and each requiring different expertise and methods. The first track is what might be called glyph taxonomy, the identification, classification, and cataloging of individual symbols. This is the most fundamental level of analysis, and it is also one of the most contentious. The basic question is deceptively simple: how many distinct glyphs are there in Rongorongo? The answer depends on where you draw the line between a distinct glyph and a variant of an existing glyph. Consider an analogy with the Latin alphabet. The letter A can be written in many different ways: uppercase, lowercase, italic, bold, serif, sans serif, handwritten in countless personal styles. All of these are recognizably the same letter, despite their visual differences. A reader of English has no difficulty recognizing all of them as A. But imagine that you are encountering the Latin alphabet for the first time, with no knowledge of English, and you are presented with a collection of handwritten samples from many different writers. How would you decide which marks are variants of the same letter and which are different letters? The task would be enormously difficult, and reasonable people might disagree about where to draw the boundaries. This is exactly the situation with Rongorongo. The glyphs show variation from tablet to tablet and even within individual tablets. A bird glyph on one tablet may differ slightly from a similar bird glyph on another: a slightly different wing angle, a slightly different beak shape, a slightly different tail. Are these the same glyph or different glyphs? The answer matters enormously because it affects every subsequent analysis. If you oversplit treating variants as separate glyphs, you end up with a huge inventory of symbols that may obscure the underlying structure of the system. If you overlump treating different glyphs as variants of the same symbol, you may erase distinctions that were meaningful to the original users of the script. Thomas Barthel's catalog, published in 1958, attempted to systematize this process. Barthel assigned a 3-digit number to each glyph he identified, with the first digit indicating the general category: human figures, birds, fish, plants, geometric shapes, and so on, and the remaining digits specifying the particular glyph within that category. His system identified approximately 600 distinct forms, though many of these are clearly variants or combinations of a smaller set of basic elements. Subsequent researchers have proposed different classification systems, some with fewer glyphs, some with more. The variation in these counts, from around 120 at the low end to over 700 at the high end, reflects the fundamental difficulty of the task and the absence of any external standard against which to check one's work. Without knowing what the glyphs mean, there is no way to know for certain whether two similar-looking symbols are really the same or really different. It is a chicken and egg problem. You need to know the meanings to classify the glyphs correctly, but you need to classify the glyphs correctly to work out the meanings. Despite this difficulty, the glyph taxonomy work has produced some important insights. It has revealed that the Rongorongo repertoire is dominated by a relatively small number of very common glyphs, with a large number of rarer glyphs that appear only a few times or even just once. This distribution, a small number of frequent symbols and a long tail of infrequent ones, is characteristic of real writing systems and is consistent with a logosyllabic system, where a core set of common syllabic signs is supplemented by a larger set of rarer logograms. The work has also revealed that many glyphs appear to be compound forms, combinations of two or more simpler elements joined together into a single glyph. A human figure may be combined with a bird head, for example, or a fish form may be merged with a geometric shape. This compounding behavior is also characteristic of many known writing systems, where compound signs are used to represent concepts or sounds that are not covered by the basic inventory of simple signs. The second track of analysis is structural, the study of how glyphs are arranged in sequences and what patterns those sequences exhibit. If Rongorongo encodes language, then the sequences of glyphs should reflect the structure of that language. Languages have grammar. They have rules about which words can follow which other words, which sounds can combine into syllables, and which syllables can combine into words. These rules produce statistical patterns. Certain combinations are common, others are rare, and others are impossible. If the glyphs represent linguistic units of any kind, words, syllables, or sounds, then the sequences of glyphs should exhibit comparable patterns. Researchers have applied various statistical techniques to test this hypothesis. One of the most basic is frequency analysis, simply counting how often each glyph appears in the corpus and comparing the resulting distribution to the frequency distributions of known writing systems. The results have been broadly consistent with linguistic text. The most common Rongorongo glyph appears hundreds of times, while many glyphs appear only once or twice. This kind of distribution, known as a Zipfian distribution after the linguist George Kingsley Zipf, is a hallmark of natural language. It is found in every known writing system and every known language, and its presence in Rongorongo is strong evidence that the script encodes language rather than being purely decorative or random. But frequency analysis alone cannot distinguish between different types of writing systems. A logographic system, a syllabic system, and an alphabetic system all produce Zipfian distributions, though with different parameters. More sophisticated analyses are needed to determine which type of system Rongorongo represents. One approach is to look at the number of distinct symbols relative to the length of the text. Alphabetic systems typically use 20 to 40 symbols. Syllabic systems use 50 to 200. Logographic systems use hundreds or thousands. The estimated number of distinct Rongorongo glyphs, somewhere between 120 and several hundred, is consistent with either a syllabic system or a logosyllabic system, but probably not a pure logographic system, which would typically require a larger inventory, or a pure alphabetic system, which would require a smaller one. Another approach is to look at the patterns of glyph co-occurrence, which glyphs tend to appear together, which tend to follow or precede specific other glyphs, and which never appear in combination. These patterns can reveal grammatical structure. In a syllabic system, for example, certain syllable combinations would be common, those that correspond to common words in the language, while others would be rare or absent because they correspond to phonological sequences that do not occur in the language. Researchers have identified several recurring sequences in the Rongorongo corpus, groups of 2, 3, or more glyphs that appear repeatedly across multiple tablets. Some of these sequences are very common, appearing dozens of times. Others are less frequent but still clearly non-random in their distribution. These recurring sequences are strong candidates for common words or phrases in the underlying language, and they have been the focus of intense scholarly attention. One particularly intriguing finding is that some of these recurring sequences appear with slight variations, a core sequence of glyphs with one or two elements that change from one occurrence to the next. This pattern is reminiscent of inflection in natural languages, where a root word is modified by the addition or alteration of affixes to indicate grammatical features like tense, number, or case. If the varying elements in these Rongorongo sequences correspond to grammatical affixes, it would be powerful evidence that the script encodes the Rapanui language at a detailed grammatical level. In other words, that it is true writing, not merely a mnemonic aid. But identifying these patterns is one thing, interpreting them is another. Without a key, without knowing what even a single glyph means, the patterns remain abstract. They tell us that the system has structure, but they do not tell us what the structure means. It is like hearing a conversation in a language you do not know. You can hear the rhythm, the intonation, the rise and fall of the voice, but you cannot understand a single word. The third track of analysis is comparative, the attempt to find connections between Rongorongo and other writing systems, other symbol systems, or other cultural traditions that might shed light on its origin and meaning. We have already discussed Guillaume de Hevessy's discredited attempt to link Rongorongo to the Indus Valley script, but there have been many other comparative efforts, some more rigorous than others. One persistent line of inquiry has been the comparison of Rongorongo glyphs with Polynesian symbols found in other cultural contexts, tattoo designs, tapa cloth patterns, rock art, and carved ornamental motifs from across the Pacific. The logic behind this comparison is that the visual vocabulary of Rongorongo may have drawn on a broader Polynesian tradition of symbolic representation, even if no other Polynesian culture developed a full writing system. If the glyphs can be traced to specific Polynesian symbols with known meanings, those meanings might provide a starting point for decipherment. This approach has produced some suggestive results but no breakthroughs. Some Rongorongo glyphs do resemble motifs found in Polynesian art, stylized birds, turtles, and human figures that are common across the Pacific. But the resemblance is general rather than specific, and it does not help with reading the script because the same visual motif might have different meanings in different cultural contexts. A bird in Rongorongo might represent the word bird, or the sound of the Rapanui word for bird, or a deity associated with birds, or something else entirely. Without additional evidence, the resemblance is merely suggestive, not probative. Another comparative approach has focused on the rock art of Rapanui itself. The island is covered in petroglyphs, images carved into the surfaces of rocks, cliffs, and cave walls. These petroglyphs include many motifs that also appear in Rongorongo: birdmen, turtles, fish, vulvas, faces, and abstract geometric designs. Some researchers have argued that the petroglyphs represent an earlier pre-writing stage of symbolic expression, and that Rongorongo evolved from the petroglyph tradition by formalizing and standardizing the symbols and using them to encode language. This evolutionary hypothesis is plausible but unproven. The relationship between the petroglyphs and Rongorongo remains unclear. The petroglyphs may be older than the script, or they may be contemporaneous. They may represent the same concepts, or they may be entirely unrelated. The visual similarities between some petroglyphs and some Rongorongo glyphs are real, but visual similarity does not necessarily imply functional similarity. There have also been attempts to compare Rongorongo with the few other undeciphered or partially deciphered scripts in the world: the Indus Valley script, the Phaistos disc from Crete, the Proto-Elamite script of ancient Iran, and the Zapotec script of Mesoamerica. These comparisons are not made in the expectation of finding a historical connection between these geographically and temporally remote systems, but rather in the hope of identifying shared structural principles that might illuminate the nature of Rongorongo. If, for example, Rongorongo shares structural features with a script that has been partially deciphered, the methods that worked for the partially deciphered script might be applicable to Rongorongo. This cross-script structural comparison is a relatively new approach, facilitated by computational tools that can analyze large datasets of symbols from different writing systems and identify statistical similarities. The results so far have been modest but encouraging. They have confirmed that Rongorongo shares certain statistical properties with known logosyllabic systems, supporting the hypothesis that it represents language at a level of detail comparable to these systems. But they have not provided a shortcut to decipherment. Let us now turn to one of the most remarkable and least publicized aspects of Rongorongo research, the study of individual tablets as unique objects with unique histories, each with its own story to tell. Consider the tablet known as the Small Santiago Tablet, or Tablet G in Barthel's catalog. This is one of the smaller tablets in the corpus, measuring approximately 32 centimeters by 12 centimeters. It is made of a dark, dense wood, and its surface is covered with neat rows of glyphs on both sides. What makes this tablet particularly interesting is its provenance, the story of how it came to be where it is today. The Small Santiago Tablet was among the objects collected by missionaries in the late 1860s and eventually transferred to the National Museum of Natural History in Santiago, Chile. Its journey from the hands of a Rapanui priest or scribe to a glass case in a museum thousands of miles away encapsulates the entire colonial history of the island, a history of extraction, dispossession, and the transformation of sacred objects into curiosities for foreign scholars. But beyond its provenance, the Small Santiago Tablet is notable for the content of its inscriptions. Several researchers have identified sections of this tablet that appear to contain highly structured, formulaic text, sequences of glyphs that repeat with systematic variations, suggesting a ritually structured composition rather than a free-form narrative. If these sections could be linked to known Rapanui ritual texts, chants, prayers, or genealogies recorded in oral form by ethnographers, they might provide the kind of parallel text that could anchor a decipherment. This possibility, the alignment of Rongorongo texts with known oral traditions, is one of the most promising avenues for future research. Despite the destruction of the literate class, the Rapanui people did not lose all of their oral traditions. Ethnographers from Raudalj onward recorded creation chants, genealogies, and ceremonial texts from islanders who had learned them through oral transmission rather than from the tablets. If any of these oral texts correspond to texts inscribed on the tablets, a comparison might reveal the relationship between the glyphs and the language. This is essentially the Rongorongo equivalent of the Rosetta Stone strategy, using a known text to decode an unknown one, but there is a critical difference. With the Rosetta Stone, the correspondence between the known text and the unknown text was explicit, the same decree, in 3 scripts on the same stone. With Rongorongo, any correspondence between oral texts and tablet texts would be inferential, based on structural similarities, thematic parallels, and educated guesswork rather than explicit labeling. Still, it is a viable approach, and several researchers have pursued it with varying degrees of rigor. The challenge is that the oral texts were recorded at a time when the cultural context was already severely disrupted, and there is no guarantee that the recorded versions are accurate or complete reflections of the original compositions. Oral traditions change over time, especially when the social structures that maintain them are disrupted. The chants recorded by Raudalj and others may be fragments, corruptions, or adaptations of earlier texts, and matching them to the tablets requires great caution. There is another tablet that deserves special attention in any account of Rongorongo research. The tablet known as Mamari, or Tablet C. We have already discussed the lunar calendar section of this tablet in the first part of this documentary, and it is worth returning to this extraordinary object in greater detail. The Mamari tablet is one of the most extensively studied objects in the corpus. It measures approximately 29 centimeters by 14 centimeters and is inscribed on both sides. Its surface is dense with glyphs, and the carving is generally well preserved, making it one of the most legible tablets in the collection. The lunar calendar section, as we discussed, is located on one face of the tablet and consists of a sequence of crescent-shaped glyphs that appear to represent the phases of the moon. This identification, first proposed independently by several researchers, is based on the systematic variation of the crescent forms from thin slivers to full circles and back again, mirroring the waxing and waning of the moon over a lunar month. But the lunar calendar section raises as many questions as it answers. How does the calendar relate to the rest of the text on the tablet? Is it embedded within a larger text, or is it set apart as a distinct section? Does it indicate specific dates, or does it describe the lunar cycle in general terms? Are the non-crescent glyphs that appear interspersed with the lunar symbols annotations, labels, or something else entirely? These questions have been the subject of detailed analysis by several researchers, including Jacques Guy, a linguist who has made significant contributions to Rongorongo scholarship. Guy's work on the Mamari tablet is notable for its methodological rigor and its frank acknowledgement of the limits of what can be determined from the available evidence. He has argued convincingly that the lunar calendar section demonstrates that Rongorongo is capable of encoding specific, unambiguous information, in this case, the sequence of lunar phases, and that this capability is consistent with true writing rather than a vague mnemonic system. But Guy has also emphasized the difficulty of generalizing from this one identifiable section to the rest of the corpus. The lunar calendar was recognizable because the relationship between the shape of the glyphs and the shape of the moon is visually obvious. Most of the other glyphs in Rongorongo do not have such a transparent relationship to their reference. A bird glyph might represent the word bird, or the sound of the first syllable of the Rapanui word for bird, or a deity whose name has nothing to do with birds, or a concept metaphorically associated with birds. Without external evidence, there is no way to determine which interpretation is correct. This is the fundamental paradox of Rongorongo research. The one section that has been convincingly identified was identifiable precisely because it did not require knowledge of the underlying language. It was a pictorial representation of a natural phenomenon, the phases of the moon, that could be recognized by anyone, regardless of linguistic background. The rest of the script, which presumably encodes linguistic content in a non-pictorial way, remains opaque. Let us now consider the human dimension of Rongorongo research, the scholars who have devoted their lives to this puzzle and the personal costs and rewards of that devotion. Rongorongo scholarship is a small and intense field. There are perhaps a few dozen active researchers worldwide who work seriously on the script, and many of them know each other personally. The field is characterized by passionate commitment, sharp disagreements, and a peculiar mixture of optimism and despair. Every researcher believes at some level that decipherment is possible, otherwise they would not continue the work. But every researcher also knows at some level that the obstacles are enormous and that success, if it comes, may not come in their lifetime. The emotional toll of this work is significant. Imagine spending years, decades studying objects that refuse to yield their secrets. Imagine learning everything there is to know about the physical characteristics of the tablets, the statistical patterns of the glyphs, the cultural context of the script, the history of the island, and still being unable to read a single word. Imagine publishing papers, presenting at conferences, engaging in debates with colleagues, refining your theories and methods, and knowing that the definitive test of your work, the moment when you can say with confidence, "This is what it says," may never come. Some researchers have thrived in this environment, finding satisfaction in the incremental progress that has been made and in the intellectual challenge of the puzzle itself. Others have been consumed by it, becoming so invested in their own theories that they lose the ability to evaluate evidence objectively. The history of Rongorongo research includes several cases of scholars who became so attached to their proposed decipherments that they refused to acknowledge valid criticisms, leading to bitter feuds and professional isolation. The case of Stephen Roger Fischer is illustrative. Fischer, a New Zealand-based linguist, published his proposed decipherment of the Santiago staff in 1997 to considerable fanfare. His theory that the text consists of creation chants structured as copulation triads was bold, specific, and testable. It attracted widespread attention in both the scholarly and popular press, but it also attracted withering criticism from other Rongorongo specialists who challenged his glyph identifications, his structural analysis, and his reliance on Metoro's readings. The debate between Fischer and his critics was often acrimonious. Fischer accused his detractors of professional jealousy and intellectual rigidity. His critics accused him of methodological sloppiness and overreach. The argument played out in academic journals, at conferences, and in personal correspondence, and it left lasting scars on the field. The tragedy of the Fischer controversy is that it obscured some genuinely interesting ideas beneath a layer of personal conflict. Whether or not Fischer's specific readings are correct, his focus on structural patterns, on the idea that the texts follow recognizable formulas, is a productive line of inquiry, and his work drew public attention to Rongorongo at a time when the field was in danger of being forgotten. But the controversy also highlighted a fundamental problem in Rongorongo research: the absence of any agreed-upon method for evaluating proposed decipherments. With a known writing system, a proposed reading can be tested against the known rules of the script and the known grammar and vocabulary of the language. With Rongorongo, there are no known rules, no agreed-upon grammar, and no confirmed vocabulary. Any proposed reading is, in a sense, unfalsifiable. It cannot be definitively proven wrong because there is no standard against which to judge it. And an unfalsifiable theory, as the philosopher Karl Popper observed, is not really a scientific theory at all. This is not to say that all proposed readings are equally valid. Some are more consistent with the available evidence than others. Some account for more of the data. Some make more plausible assumptions about the nature of the script. But in the absence of a definitive key, all proposed readings remain provisional, and the field remains in a state of productive but frustrating uncertainty. Among the scholars who have contributed most significantly to the field in recent decades, several names stand out for the quality and rigor of their work. Jacques Guy, whom we have already mentioned, is a French-born linguist who has published extensively on the structural analysis of Rongorongo. Guy's approach is characterized by methodological caution and a willingness to say, "We do not know," when the evidence does not support a definitive conclusion. He has made important contributions to the understanding of the lunar calendar section of the Mamari tablet and has published detailed analyses of glyph frequency and distribution patterns across the corpus. His work has helped to establish the statistical foundation on which much subsequent research has been built. Konstantin Pozdniakov, a Russian linguist, has focused on the identification of structural units within the Rongorongo texts, sequences of glyphs that behave like words or phrases in their distributional properties. Pozdniakov's work, conducted in collaboration with his colleague Igor Pozdniakov, has identified a number of recurring patterns that appear to represent common linguistic elements, and has proposed a structural model of the script that is consistent with a syllabic or logosyllabic system. Their analyses, published in a series of papers in the early 21st century, represent some of the most rigorous statistical work that has been done on Rongorongo and have been influential in shaping the current understanding of the script structure. Rafał Wojciech, a Polish researcher, has focused on the application of computational methods to Rongorongo analysis. Wojciech has developed digital tools for comparing glyph forms across different tablets, identifying allographic variation, the range of visual forms that a single glyph can take, and mapping the distribution of specific glyphs and glyph sequences throughout the corpus. His work has contributed to the creation of digital databases that make the Rongorongo corpus more accessible to researchers worldwide. Albert Davlichin, a Russian-born Mesoamericanist who has brought expertise in the decipherment of other scripts to the study of Rongorongo, has proposed some of the most specific and potentially testable hypotheses about the nature of the script. Davlichin has argued that certain Rongorongo glyphs can be identified as logograms representing specific Rapanui words, based on the visual resemblance between the glyph and the object or concept it depicts, combined with phonological analysis of the Rapanui language. His proposals remain controversial, but they represent one of the most promising current approaches to the decipherment problem. These and other researchers form a small but dedicated community of scholars who are slowly, painstakingly, pushing the boundaries of what is known about Rongorongo. They do not always agree with each other. The field is characterized by vigorous debate, but they share a commitment to rigorous methodology and a respect for the enormity of the challenge they face. The question of whether artificial intelligence will eventually crack the Rongorongo code is one that generates both excitement and skepticism among scholars. The excitement is understandable. In recent years, AI systems have achieved remarkable successes in pattern recognition, language processing, and code breaking. Machine learning algorithms have been used to analyze ancient texts, identify patterns in undeciphered scripts, and even propose partial readings of previously unreadable inscriptions. The potential for AI to contribute to Rongorongo research is real, but the skepticism is equally well-founded. The fundamental challenge of Rongorongo decipherment is not pattern recognition, it is the absence of external anchoring. A machine learning algorithm can identify every statistical pattern in the Rongorongo corpus. It can tell you which glyphs co-occur, which sequences recur, which distributional patterns match known writing systems. But it cannot tell you what a glyph means unless it has some external reference point, a bilingual text, a known correspondence between at least a few glyphs and known words, or a large enough corpus to allow purely internal statistical methods to converge on a unique solution. The Rongorongo corpus is too small for purely internal methods to work. With only about 15,000 glyph tokens spread across 26 objects, the statistical power of any analysis is severely limited. There are simply not enough data points to constrain the solution space sufficiently. In a larger corpus, say, hundreds of thousands of glyph tokens, internal statistical methods might have a chance of identifying enough patterns to bootstrap a decipherment. But with the existing corpus, the number of possible solutions is astronomically large, and there is no statistical basis for choosing among them. This does not mean AI is useless. It can help with documentation, improving the quality of glyph identification, and reducing human error in transcription. It can help with classification, identifying glyph variants, and grouping them more objectively than human researchers have been able to do. It can help with structural analysis, testing hypotheses about the grammatical structure of the texts more efficiently than manual methods allow. And it can help with comparative analysis, searching for structural parallels between Rongorongo and known writing systems across large databases of scripts. But the dream of simply feeding the Rongorongo corpus into a computer and having it spit out a translation is, for now, a fantasy. The problem is not computational power. The problem is information. There is simply not enough known information about the correspondence between the glyphs and the language to constrain a decipherment, and no amount of computing power can compensate for that fundamental deficit. The solution, if it comes, will most likely involve a combination of computational analysis and human insight, a scholar who notices a pattern that a computer missed, or a computer that identifies a pattern that a scholar can then interpret in the light of cultural and linguistic knowledge. The interplay between human and machine intelligence is where the greatest promise lies, and there is always the possibility of a lucky discovery. A new tablet found in a forgotten collection or excavated from an archaeological site could dramatically expand the corpus. A bilingual text, however improbable, would be transformative. Even a fragment with a few identifiable glyphs paired with identifiable images or numbers could provide the anchor that is currently missing. The history of decipherment is full of such lucky breaks. The Rosetta Stone was found by accident by a soldier digging a trench. The key to the Maya script came partly from a colonial-era manuscript that had been sitting in a library for centuries, unrecognized for what it was. The decipherment of Linear B was aided by the discovery of large archives of tablets at Knossos and Pylos. In each case, the breakthrough came not solely from intellectual brilliance, but from the serendipitous availability of new evidence. Could such a break happen for Rongorongo? It is not impossible. There may be tablets in private collections that have never been publicly documented. There may be fragments buried in the soil of Rapanui, preserved in caves or hidden in the walls of stone structures. There may be colonial-era documents, missionary records, traders' logs, sailors' journals that contain information about the tablets that has not yet been recognized as relevant. The search continues. The hope endures. There's a dimension of the Rongorongo story that we have not yet fully explored, and it concerns the relationship between the script and the broader cultural and intellectual achievements of the Rapanui people. We have spoken of the Moai, the enormous stone statues. We have spoken of the Ahu, the ceremonial platforms. We have spoken of the Birdman ceremony at Orongo. But these are only the most visible expressions of a civilization that was rich in ways that are less immediately obvious. The Rapanui were master astronomers. Like other Polynesian peoples, they navigated by the stars, and they maintained a detailed knowledge of celestial movements that was essential for both navigation and agriculture. The positions of the stars determined when to plant, when to harvest, when to fish, and when to hold ceremonies. The Moai themselves may have had astronomical alignments. Some researchers have proposed that certain Ahu were oriented toward specific celestial events, such as solstices or equinoxes, though this hypothesis remains debated. If the Rapanui encoded their astronomical knowledge in the Rongorongo tablets, those tablets would contain information of extraordinary scientific value. The astronomical observations of an isolated Pacific island civilization, recorded over centuries, could provide data on stellar positions, seasonal cycles, and celestial phenomena that are unavailable from any other source. The loss of this knowledge, if it exists on the tablets, would be a loss not just for Rapanui cultural heritage, but for the history of science itself. The Rapanui were also skilled ecologists, at least initially. When they first arrived on the island, they found a landscape covered in forests, with a diverse array of plant and animal species adapted to the subtropical climate. They developed agricultural techniques suited to the island's volcanic soils, including the use of lithic mulching, covering fields with rocks to retain moisture and regulate soil temperature, and the cultivation of crops in sheltered depressions and stone enclosures called manavai. These techniques allowed them to sustain a population of several thousand on an island with limited arable land and no permanent streams. But the ecological history of Rapa Nui is also a cautionary tale. Over the centuries, the island's forests were progressively cleared for agriculture, for fuel, for the construction of canoes, and for the rollers and sledges used to transport moai. By the time Europeans arrived, the island was almost completely deforested. The giant palms that had once dominated the landscape were extinct. The loss of trees led to soil erosion, reduced agricultural productivity, and the extinction of several bird species that had depended on the forest habitat. This ecological transformation has been the subject of intense scholarly debate. The most famous account, popularized by the geographer Jared Diamond, portrays the deforestation of Rapa Nui as a case of ecocide, the self-destruction of a civilization through unsustainable exploitation of its environment. Diamond argued that the Rapanui, in their obsession with building ever larger moai, consumed their island's resources to the point of collapse, leading to famine, war, and population decline. This narrative has been challenged by other researchers who argue that the story is more complex. Some have pointed to the role of introduced rats, which may have eaten the seeds of the island's palm trees and contributed to deforestation. Others have emphasized the resilience and adaptability of the Rapanui, who developed innovative agricultural techniques to cope with environmental change. Still others have argued that the population decline was caused primarily by European diseases and slave raids rather than by internal ecological collapse. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. The deforestation was real and did have significant consequences, but the Rapanui were not passive victims of their own folly. They adapted, innovated, and survived until the external catastrophes of the 19th century overwhelmed them. What does this ecological history have to do with Rongorongo? Potentially a great deal. If the tablets contain historical records, they might document the environmental changes that occurred on the island, the loss of forests, the decline of certain species, the adaptation of agricultural practices. They might contain the Rapanui's own understanding of what was happening to their environment and how they responded to it. They might contain warnings, laments, or practical advice related to the management of scarce resources. Or they might contain nothing of the sort. We simply do not know. But the possibility that the tablets hold ecological knowledge, the environmental observations of an isolated civilization over centuries of landscape transformation, is one of the most intriguing and potentially important aspects of the Rongorongo mystery. The political and ethical dimensions of Rongorongo are also significant and deserve careful consideration. The tablets are cultural property of the Rapanui people. They were created by Rapanui scribes using Rapanui symbols encoding Rapanui knowledge. They were taken from the island under circumstances that ranged from dubious to outright theft, and they are now held by institutions in foreign countries where they are studied by foreign scholars and displayed for foreign audiences. This situation reflects a broader pattern of colonial extraction that has affected indigenous peoples around the world. The objects that define a culture's identity, its art, its texts, its sacred objects, were taken by colonizers, missionaries, and collectors and deposited in museums far from their places of origin. The communities that created these objects were often devastated by the same colonial processes that facilitated the collection, leaving them unable to resist the removal of their heritage. In recent decades, there has been a growing movement to address this injustice through repatriation, the return of cultural objects to their communities of origin. This movement has achieved significant successes in some cases. Museums have returned human remains, sacred objects, and cultural artifacts to indigenous communities in various parts of the world, but the process is slow, contentious, and politically complex. Museums resist repatriation for various reasons: concerns about conservation, scholarly access, legal ownership, and the precedent that returns might set. For the Rongorongo tablets, the repatriation question is particularly fraught. The tablets are among the most important undeciphered texts in the world, and scholars argue that they need to be accessible for study. But the Rapanui community argues that the tablets are their heritage and should be held on their island under their stewardship. The two positions are not necessarily incompatible. Digital documentation can ensure scholarly access even if the physical objects are returned, but the practical and political obstacles to repatriation remain significant. There is also the question of who has the right to study and interpret the tablets. Some Rapanui community members have expressed concern that foreign scholars are attempting to decode their ancestral script without adequate consultation with or involvement of the Rapanui people. They argue that the tablets are not merely academic puzzles but sacred objects with cultural and spiritual significance, and that any attempt to interpret them should be conducted in partnership with the community rather than imposed from outside. This perspective challenges the traditional model of academic research, in which scholars claim the right to study any object or phenomenon that interests them, regardless of the wishes of the communities connected to that object. It raises questions about intellectual property, cultural sovereignty, and the ethics of knowledge production. And it has practical implications for the conduct of research. Should scholars be required to obtain community consent before studying the tablets? Should the Rapanui community have a voice in how findings are published and disseminated? Should Rapanui scholars be trained and supported to conduct their own research on the script? These questions do not have easy answers, but they are increasingly central to the practice of anthropology, archaeology, and linguistics worldwide. The Rongorongo case is one example of a broader reckoning with the colonial legacy of these disciplines and the need to develop more equitable and respectful approaches to the study of indigenous cultural heritage. Let us now consider some of the more speculative but fascinating theories about Rongorongo that have been proposed over the years. These theories range from the plausible to the improbable, and they reflect the wide range of imaginations that have been brought to bear on the mystery. One theory proposed by several researchers at different times is that Rongorongo tablets were used as mnemonic aids for navigation. The Polynesians were, as we have discussed, the greatest navigators in human history. Their ability to cross thousands of miles of open ocean without instruments is one of the most remarkable achievements of any civilization. This ability depended on an encyclopedic knowledge of the stars, the currents, the winds, the behaviors of marine life, and countless other natural phenomena that served as navigational cues. This navigational knowledge was traditionally transmitted orally, through chants, stories, and direct instruction. But on Rapanui, where the isolation of the island made long-distance voyaging both more difficult and more critical, there might have been an incentive to encode this knowledge in a more permanent form. Rongorongo tablets could, according to this theory, contain navigational instructions, descriptions of star paths, current patterns, island locations, and seasonal conditions that would guide a voyager across the Pacific. This theory is speculative but not implausible. The Rapanui language, like other Polynesian languages, has a rich vocabulary for describing oceanic phenomena, and the Rongorongo glyphs include numerous marine motifs, fish, birds, waves, and abstract forms that could represent currents or wind patterns. If even one tablet could be shown to contain navigational information, it would be a discovery of immense significance for our understanding of Polynesian wayfinding. Another theory concerns the possibility that some Rongorongo tablets contain records of historical events, not mythological narratives or cosmogonic chants, but factual accounts of specific events in the history of the island. Wars between clans, the construction and dedication of specific moai, the arrival or departure of voyaging canoes, natural disasters such as droughts or tsunamis, the reigns of specific paramount chiefs. All of these events could have been recorded in a writing system and would constitute a historical archive of incalculable value. The fragmentary testimony of 19th-century informants supports this possibility. Several informants told ethnographers that some tablets contained accounts of wars and conflicts. Others said they contained records of important deaths or notable events. If these accounts are accurate, then at least some of the tablets are historical documents, the annals of a civilization written by its own scribes. A more controversial theory proposes that Rongorongo may contain mathematical or astronomical information encoded in the arrangement and frequency of specific glyphs. Proponents of this theory have pointed to patterns in the distribution of certain glyphs that could correspond to numerical sequences, calendrical cycles, or astronomical periods. The confirmed lunar calendar on the Mamari tablet lends some support to this idea, but extending it to other tablets and other types of mathematical content remains speculative. And then there are the more extreme theories, the ones that venture into territory that most mainstream scholars consider unfounded, but that continue to capture the public imagination. Some popular writers have suggested that Rongorongo encodes knowledge of a lost civilization, a pre-Polynesian culture that inhabited the Pacific in deep antiquity and whose existence has been erased from conventional historical records. Others have proposed that the tablets contain prophecies, warnings, or messages intended for future generations, a kind of time capsule from a dying civilization. Still others have linked Rongorongo to theories about extraterrestrial contact, ancient global networks, or other speculative frameworks. These theories, while entertaining, are not supported by the available evidence. There is no archaeological, genetic, or linguistic evidence for a pre-Polynesian civilization on Rapa Nui. The tablets are made of wood and carved with known Rapanui techniques, and there is nothing about them that requires explanation by reference to external or supernatural agencies. The mystery of Rongorongo is deep enough without embellishment. The real story, a small, isolated people who independently invented writing, were destroyed by colonial violence and left behind a script that no one can read, is more astonishing than any fiction. We should also address a question that has been asked many times but is often glossed over in popular accounts. Could the Rongorongo tablets be purely decorative? Could the glyphs be ornamental patterns with no linguistic content, the equivalent of wallpaper or textile designs? The answer, based on the available evidence, is almost certainly no. There are several strong arguments against the purely decorative hypothesis. First, the statistical properties of the glyph sequences, the Zipfian frequency distribution, the recurring sequences with systematic variations, the distributional patterns consistent with grammatical structure, are characteristic of linguistic text and inconsistent with purely random or decorative arrangements. Decorative patterns tend to be more repetitive and more symmetrical than linguistic text, and they do not exhibit the kind of variation and complexity that is found in the Rongorongo corpus. Second, the cultural context argues against the decorative hypothesis. The testimony of 19th century informants consistently describes the tablets as objects that were read or recited, held by specialists who chanted texts associated with the inscribed symbols. Whether these recitations were true readings or memory-aided performances, they indicate that the symbols were understood to carry specific content, not merely decorative value. Third, the sheer effort involved in carving the tablets argues against a purely decorative function. Each tablet represents hours or days of painstaking work, hundreds or thousands of tiny, precisely carved glyphs, each requiring careful planning and skilled execution. This level of effort is consistent with the production of a meaningful document, but excessive for mere decoration, especially on a resource-poor island where wood was scarce and labor was valuable. Fourth, the diversity of the glyph inventory argues against decoration. Purely decorative systems tend to use a small number of repeated motifs arranged in patterns. Rongorongo uses hundreds of distinct glyphs arranged in non-repeating sequences. This is consistent with a representational system, one designed to convey specific information rather than a decorative one. For all of these reasons, the scholarly consensus is that Rongorongo is not decoration. It is a system that encodes meaningful content. The debate is about the nature of that content, whether it is full linguistic text, a mnemonic aid for oral performance, or something in between, not about whether it has content at all. Let us pause and consider an aspect of this story that is easy to overlook but profoundly important: the experience of the Rapanui people in the modern era and their relationship to the Rongorongo heritage. The Rapanui people today are the descendants of the survivors of the catastrophe of the 19th century. They carry within them the genetic, cultural, and emotional legacy of that catastrophe. They live on an island that was once the center of a thriving, independent civilization, but that spent most of the 20th century as a neglected and exploited colony, administered first by a private company and later by a distant government, with the islanders' rights and autonomy severely restricted. The cultural revitalization that has occurred on Rapa Nui in recent decades is a remarkable story of resilience and determination. The Rapanui language, once in danger of extinction, is being taught in schools and used in daily life. Traditional arts, carving, tattooing, dancing, chanting, are being practiced and transmitted to new generations. The island's cultural heritage, including the Moai and the Ahu, is being preserved and maintained with the active involvement of the community, but Rongorongo remains a source of both pride and pain. It is a source of pride because it demonstrates that the ancestors of the Rapanui were among the most intellectually accomplished peoples in the Pacific, that they achieved something, the invention of writing, that no other Polynesian culture achieved. It is a source of pain because it represents knowledge that was lost, knowledge that belongs to the Rapanui, but that the Rapanui can no longer access. For some Rapanui, the inability to read the tablets is a personal wound, a daily reminder of what was taken from them. For others, it is a challenge, a motivation to support and participate in the research effort, to reclaim ownership of their heritage, and to ensure that the story of Rongorongo is told on their terms, not just as a puzzle for foreign scholars to solve. In recent years, there have been efforts to involve the Rapanui community more directly in Rongorongo research. Some researchers have collaborated with Rapanui scholars and cultural leaders. Educational programs have been developed to teach young Rapanui about the tablets and the ongoing research into their meaning. And there are Rapanui individuals who have taken an active interest in the decipherment effort, studying the tablets, learning about linguistic methods, and contributing their own cultural knowledge to the scholarly discussion. These developments are encouraging, but they also highlight the inequities that still characterize the field. The vast majority of Rongorongo research is still conducted by foreign scholars, published in foreign languages, and disseminated through foreign academic channels. The Rapanui community has limited access to the tablets themselves, which are held in foreign museums. And the cultural knowledge that the Rapanui possess, the oral traditions, the ceremonial practices, the lived experience of being Rapanui, is not always valued by the academic establishment as a legitimate source of scholarly insight. Addressing these inequities is not just a matter of political correctness. It is a matter of good scholarship. The Rapanui possess cultural knowledge that no foreign scholar, however brilliant, can replicate. They know things about their language, their traditions, their way of seeing the world that are relevant to the interpretation of the tablets. If the decipherment of Rongorongo ever succeeds, it will likely require the active participation of the Rapanui community, not as passive informants, but as equal partners in the research enterprise. The future of Rongorongo research is uncertain but not hopeless. There are several possible scenarios, ranging from the optimistic to the pessimistic, and it is worth considering each of them. The most optimistic scenario is a breakthrough, a discovery that provides the key to the script and allows it to be read. This might come in the form of a new tablet, found in a forgotten collection or excavated from the soil of Rapanui. It might come from a colonial-era document that contains information about the script that has not yet been recognized. It might come from a methodological innovation, a new computational technique, a new linguistic theory, a new way of analyzing the existing evidence that reveals patterns that have previously been invisible. Or it might come from a combination of these, a lucky discovery that provides a small anchor point, followed by intensive analysis that extends that anchor point to the rest of the corpus. This scenario is not impossible. Breakthroughs in decipherment have occurred throughout history, often after decades or centuries of failure. The Maya script was considered hopeless for over a century before it was cracked. Egyptian hieroglyphics were unreadable for over 1,000 years before Champollion. The pace of discovery in archaeology and linguistic analysis is accelerating, and new technologies are making it possible to extract information from artifacts in ways that were unimaginable a generation ago. A more moderate scenario is incremental progress, a slow accumulation of insights that gradually narrows the range of possible interpretations without achieving a definitive breakthrough. In this scenario, researchers continue to identify structural patterns, classify glyphs, and test hypotheses, building a body of knowledge that brings us closer to understanding the script without ever fully cracking it. This is essentially what has been happening for the past century and a half, and it is likely to continue regardless of whether a breakthrough occurs. The most pessimistic scenario is permanent silence, the possibility that the script will never be read because the information needed to decode it has been irretrievably lost. If Rongorongo is a mnemonic system that depends on knowledge that existed only in the minds of the Tangata Rongorongo, knowledge that died with them in the Peruvian slave mines, then no amount of analysis, however sophisticated, will be able to recover it. The symbols may be permanently disconnected from their meanings, like words in a dead language that has left no descendants, no bilingual texts, and no living speakers. This is a genuinely possible outcome. Not every mystery has a solution, not every code can be cracked, and the circumstances of Rongorongo, the tiny corpus, the absence of external anchors, the complete extinction of the reading tradition, make it one of the most difficult decipherment challenges in the world. But even if the script is never read, the effort to understand it has value. The research that has been conducted on Rongorongo over the past century and a half has produced important insights into the nature of writing, the history of human communication, and the cultural achievements of the Rapanui people. It has advanced our understanding of how writing systems work, how they originate, and how they can be analyzed. And it has kept alive the memory of a civilization that might otherwise have been forgotten, a civilization that achieved something extraordinary on a tiny island in the middle of the world's largest ocean. We come now to the deepest and most philosophical dimension of the Rongorongo story, the question of what it means for knowledge to be lost. We live in an age of information abundance. More data is produced every day than was created in the entire history of the world before the digital era. We have databases, archives, libraries, the internet. We can store, retrieve, and transmit information with a speed and efficiency that would have been unimaginable to the scribes of Rapanui. And yet, we are also living through an era of knowledge loss. Languages are dying at an alarming rate. By some estimates, one language disappears every 2 weeks. With each language that dies, a unique way of understanding the world is lost, a vocabulary, a grammar, a body of accumulated knowledge about the natural environment, about human relationships, about the meaning of life. This knowledge, built up over thousands of years of human experience, is irreplaceable once it is gone. Rongorongo is a symbol of this broader crisis. It is a physical embodiment of knowledge loss, a set of objects that we can see and touch but cannot understand, a message from the past that we cannot decode. It stands as a warning that the things we know, the things we create, the things we value can be taken from us by violence, by neglect, by indifference, and that once they are gone, they may be gone forever. The Rapanui did not lose their script because of some inherent weakness in their civilization. They lost it because foreign forces, slave raiders, disease, missionaries destroyed the social structures that maintained it. The Tangata Rongorongo were not forgotten because they were unimportant. They were killed because they were vulnerable. The knowledge they carried was not inherently fragile. It was made fragile by the violence inflicted upon the people who held it. This is a crucial point because it shifts the responsibility for the loss from the victims to the perpetrators. The Rapanui did not fail to preserve their writing system. Their writing system was taken from them, along with their freedom, their health, and their lives. The silence of the tablets is not a reflection of Rapanui inadequacy. It is a reflection of the destructive power of colonialism and exploitation, and this understanding carries with it an obligation. If the silence of Rongorongo was caused by human action, then human action has a responsibility to address it, to continue the research, to support the Rapanui community, to return the tablets to their place of origin, and to honor the memory of the people who created them. Let us visit in our imagination the island one final time. It is dawn on Rapanui. The sun is rising over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The Moai on the eastern coast stand in silhouette against the brightening horizon, their massive forms dark against the light. The wind blows across the grasslands, carrying the scent of salt and stone. The ocean crashes against the volcanic cliffs, as it has done for millions of years, indifferent to the dramas that have played out on the small piece of land above it. Somewhere on this island, perhaps in a cave, perhaps in the rubble of a collapsed stone house, perhaps in a forgotten corner of a field, there may be a wooden board lying in the soil. Its surface, if it has survived the centuries, would still bear the marks of a human hand, tiny carved figures, birds and fish in crescents and circles, arranged in neat rows that reversed direction with every line. It would be a message. It would be a voice. It would be a connection to a world that has vanished, a world of master navigators and monumental builders, of sacred chants and genealogical records, of priests who held the knowledge of their people in their minds and in their hands and on their carved wooden boards. Or perhaps there are no more tablets to be found. Perhaps the 26 that survive are all that remain. Perhaps the rest have rotted in the damp earth, burned in missionaries' fires, crumbled to dust in the salt air of the Pacific. Perhaps what we have is all we will ever have. If so, then those 26 objects carry an almost unbearable weight. They are the last words of a lost world. They are the final testament of a civilization that was destroyed before it could pass on its knowledge. They are the only remaining traces of a writing system that was invented independently by one of the most isolated and remarkable peoples in the history of the world, and they are silent. They have been silent for over 150 years. They may be silent forever, or they may someday speak again if someone finds the key, if the right insight comes, if the right discovery is made, if the barriers that separate us from the minds of the Rapanui scribes can somehow be crossed. The odds are not in our favor. The obstacles are enormous. The chain of transmission has been broken. The readers are dead. Language, while still spoken, may have changed in ways that make the ancient texts unrecoverable. The corpus is tiny. The external evidence is almost non-existent, and yet the search continues. Scholars sit in their offices and laboratories, poring over high-resolution photographs of the tablets, analyzing frequency distributions, testing hypotheses, arguing with colleagues, publishing papers, attending conferences, and refusing, stubbornly, magnificently refusing, to give up. They do this not because they are certain of success. They do it because the attempt matters, because every piece of knowledge recovered from the wreckage of a destroyed civilization is a victory, a small act of justice, a small repayment of an enormous debt. They do it because the tablets deserve it, because the people who carved them deserve it, because the Tangata Rongorongo, who died in chains in a foreign land, holding in their minds the meaning of every glyph on every board, deserve to have their words heard again. They do it because the silence of Rongorongo is not just a puzzle. It is an accusation. It accuses us of what was done to the Rapanui people. It accuses us of the violence and exploitation that destroyed a civilization. And it challenges us to respond not with guilt, which is passive and unproductive, but with action, with research, with preservation, with respect. With the determination to understand what was written on those boards, even if it takes another century or another millennium. There is a Rapanui word that captures something of the spirit of this quest. The word is mana. In the Rapanui language, as in many Polynesian languages, mana refers to a kind of spiritual power or authority, a force that resides in people, objects, and places. The Moai have mana, the Ahu have mana, the island itself has mana. And the Rongorongo tablets, as sacred objects inscribed with sacred knowledge, would have been understood by the Rapanui as objects of profound mana, objects imbued with the spiritual authority of the ancestors, the power of the gods, the accumulated wisdom of generations. When the Tangata Rongorongo were taken from the island, their mana went with them. When they died, their mana was lost. When the tablets were taken from the island, their mana was displaced, carried away to foreign lands, where it sits in museum cases, unrecognized and unacknowledged. The concept of mana is not easily translatable into Western categories of thought. It is not simply power or authority in the political sense. It is more like a fundamental quality of being, a measure of the depth and significance of a person or object, the degree to which they are connected to the sources of life and meaning. An object with great mana is not just valuable, it is alive with significance. It resonates, it matters. The Rongorongo tablets have mana. Even silent, even unread, even scattered across the museums of the world, they resonate with significance. They matter. They matter because of what they represent, the intellectual achievement of a remarkable people, the knowledge of a vanished civilization, the last words of a lost world. And they matter because of what they ask of us. They ask us to pay attention, they ask us to remember, they ask us to keep searching, keep questioning, keep trying to understand, they ask us not to accept the silence as final. The story of Rongorongo does not have an ending, at least not yet. It is an ongoing story, a narrative without a conclusion, a question still waiting for an answer. The tablets sit in their cases, the scholars sit at their desks. The people of Rapanui go about their lives on their small island in the Pacific, carrying within them the genetic and cultural heritage of the civilization that created the script. The wind blows across the grasslands, the Moai stare into the distance, and the glyphs, the birds, the fish, the human figures, the crescents, the circles, the strange hybrid forms, remain carved in the wood, unchanged, patient, waiting. They have waited for over 150 years. They can wait longer. They have all the time in the world. Time, after all, means nothing to a piece of wood. It means nothing to a carved symbol. The symbols will look the same 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, as they do today. They will continue to pose the same question, to issue the same challenge, to maintain the same tantalizing, infuriating, magnificent silence. The question is whether we, the human beings who inhabit this planet, who speak and write and read, who build civilizations and destroy them, who create knowledge and lose it, whether we will prove worthy of the challenge, whether we will muster the intelligence, the patience, the creativity, and the humility needed to hear what those wooden boards have to say. The Rapanui scribes did their part. They created something extraordinary. They carved their knowledge into wood with shark teeth and obsidian flakes, line by line, glyph by glyph, in the reverse Boustrophedon pattern that no other civilization ever devised. They did this on a small island in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth, with no connection to any other literate tradition, with no model to follow and no precedent to draw on. They invented writing. They created a script. They encoded their knowledge in a permanent physical form that has survived the destruction of the civilization that created it. Now it is our turn. It is our turn to sit with the tablets, to study the symbols, to test the hypotheses, to run the algorithms, to compare the patterns, to listen, really listen for the faintest echo of a voice that fell silent 150 years ago. It is our turn, and we owe it to them to try. Think of what we might hear if we could learn to listen. Think of the voices that might emerge from those carved wooden boards, the voices of priests chanting creation myths in the flickering light of ritual fires, the voices of genealogists reciting the names of ancestors, generation after generation, stretching back through the centuries to the first canoes that touched the shores of Rapa Nui, the voices of astronomers describing the movements of stars, the phases of the moon, the rhythm of the seasons. The voices of historians recording the events that shaped their world, the building of the great Moai, the rivalries between clans, the ceremonies at Orongo, the arrival of strange ships from beyond the horizon. Think of those voices. They are not gone. They are only hidden, encoded in the tiny figures carved into 26 pieces of wood, waiting to be decoded, waiting to be heard, waiting to speak again after a century and a half of silence. The mystery of Rongorongo is not just a puzzle for linguists and archaeologists. It is a mystery that belongs to all of us. It is a mystery about the nature of human knowledge, the fragility of human civilization, and the enduring power of the human impulse to create, to record, to remember. The 26 tablets of Easter Island are among the most precious and most tragic objects on Earth. They are precious because they represent the highest intellectual achievement of one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history. They are tragic because the key to understanding them has been lost, perhaps forever. But as long as the tablets survive, the possibility of understanding them survives with them. As long as someone is studying the glyphs, comparing the patterns, testing the theories, pushing the boundaries of what is known, the silence is not complete. It is a silence waiting to be broken, and somewhere perhaps in the mind of a scholar not yet born, or in the circuits of a computer not yet built, or in the soil of an island not yet fully explored, the key exists. The key to Rongorongo, the key to the last words of a lost world. We may find it, we may not. But the search itself, the refusal to accept the silence, the determination to keep asking the question, the stubborn, beautiful human insistence that meaning can be recovered from the wreckage of destruction, the search itself is worthy of the people who carved those boards. The search itself is worthy of us all. The wind blows across Rapanui. The Moai stand in their ancient watch. The ocean stretches to the horizon in every direction, vast and indifferent and full of secrets. And on 26 pieces of wood, scattered across the museums of the world, the tiny carved figures of Rongorongo hold their silence, patient, enigmatic, enduring. The last words of a lost world, still waiting to be read.